Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It was early, around 7:30 in the morning, and the sky was just starting to lighten up, casting this pale grey glow over everything. The air was crisp, with that bite that makes your breath fog up, and I remember pulling my jacket tighter as we got ready to be dropped off. There were 4 of us in the crew, including me, and we'd been working together for a few weeks at that point. We were all pretty used to the routine. Helicopter comes in, we unload, set up the gear, and start cutting. But that morning, as we were hovering over the landing zone, I noticed something odd right away. Instead of the usual mountain goats or deer scattered on the ridges, there was this figure, just standing there on a ridge, maybe a couple hundred yards away. At first I thought it was a bear. You see a lot of those out there, and they can look deceptively human-like sometimes when they're standing on their hind legs. But as the helicopter set down and the rotor wash died down, we all kind of froze and stared. This thing was brown, like dark, matted fur, and it was massive. I mean, we're talking huge. Later, we estimated it was between 11 and 13 feet tall, which sounds insane, but I swear that's what it looked like. It was shaped like a person, but way too big to be human, and it was just walking along the ridge, slow and steady, like it owned the place. We didn't say much at first. We were all just watching, huddled together near the helicopter. The pilot was still with us, and he saw it too. I remember him muttering something under his breath, but I couldn't make it out over the adrenaline pounding in my ears. We stood there for what felt like forever, but it was probably about 20 minutes. The whole time, this thing kept moving, and then it stopped, dead in its tracks. It stood perfectly still for what had to be 5 minutes, just frozen, like it was trying to blend into the trees or something. That was the first time I felt this knot form in my stomach, because bears don't do that. They don't stand that still unless they're hunting, and this was different. It was almost like it was posing as part of the landscape. Then, out of nowhere, it bent over. Not like an animal, but like a person touching their toes, real smooth and deliberate. It stayed like that for a few seconds before straightening up again, and I remember my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. We were all whispering to each other, things like, "What the hell is that? And is it looking at us?" But nobody had any answers. The silence around us felt heavier than usual, like the forest was holding its breath. After it stood back up, we had to get to work. We couldn't just stand there gawking all day. The boss gave us the signal, and we started unpacking the chainsaws and other gear. I kept glancing back at the ridge, but it was still there, just watching us. Or at least, that's what it felt like. I couldn't see its eyes from that distance, but I had this overwhelming sense that it was intelligent, like it knew we were there and was studying us. That's when the real fear set in. It wasn't just some animal, it was something else, something that felt ancient and aware. We got busy with the logging, trying to focus on the job, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the saw. The noise of the engines and the trees falling should have drowned out everything else, but I kept feeling this pull to look back. After maybe 10 minutes of work, I finally caved and turned around. The ridge was empty, just like that. It was gone. No sound, no movement, nothing. It was as if it had never been there. But the image was burned into my brain. We all kind of stopped what we were doing and stared at the spot, and I remember one of the guys saying, "Where'd it go?" in this hushed voice, like he was afraid it might hear us. The rest of the morning was a blur. We worked, but nobody was really into it. Every little noise, a branch snapping, the wind rustling the leaves, made us jump. I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see it again, but there was nothing. Around midday, we took a break for lunch, and that's when things got even weirder. We were sitting on some logs, eating our sandwiches, when one of the crew members called us over to the grapple block. That's the area where we pile the logs for the helicopter to pick up. He'd found tracks, not bear tracks, not anything we'd ever seen before. These things were huge, about 16 inches long and 7 inches wide, with a deep imprint in the mud. They were shaped like a human foot, but way bigger, and the toes were spread out, almost like it had been standing there for a while. Seeing those tracks made my blood run cold. It was proof, in a way, that we hadn't imagined it. We all gathered around taking pictures with a disposable camera one of the guys had, but none of us wanted to stay there long. The air felt charged, like we were being watched, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was still close by. We finished up work early that day. The boss decided to call it quits because everyone was so on edge. As we packed up to be picked up by the helicopter, I couldn't help but look back at that ridge one more time. Nothing, just the empty forest. But now it felt hostile, like it had secrets it didn't want to share. Later, when we got back to camp, we talked about it over beers, but nobody had any explanations. Some guys said it must have been a bear, but bears don't leave tracks like that, and they don't stand still for minutes on end. Others joked about Bigfoot, but it wasn't funny, not when you've seen it with your own eyes. I went to bed that night with this chill that wouldn't go away, and I dreamt of that figure staring at me from the trees. The next few days were tense, but we had to keep working. On the last day of the month, August 31st, we were at a new landing spot, one that was muddier from recent rain. My partner and I were setting up when we found more tracks, but these were smaller, still human-shaped, walking on 2 feet, but about half the size of the ones we'd seen before, with wide toes that splayed out in the mud. It hit me then. This wasn't just one creature. There might be more, maybe a juvenile, like a family. The thought made my skin crawl. We took more pictures, but I didn't need them to remember. That image of the massive figure on the ridge staring right at us is seared into my memory. I rotated out of work after that, and I've never been back to that area. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I'll catch a movement out of the corner of my eye, and my heart will skip a beat. But I never saw it again. To this day, I can't explain what it was, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is that in those moments, watching it move and stand and disappear, I felt a fear so deep it stayed with me, like a shadow I can't shake. And every time I tell myself it was just my imagination, I remember those tracks and the way it bent over like a man, and I know it was real. Story 2. It was a cold night in late November, I think, because the snow had been on the ground for a bit already. We'd decided to go hiking around 10 p.m., which might sound crazy to some people, but we liked the quiet and the stars were out, so why not? There were 4 of us total, all guys, all friends from college. We parked near the Rock Canyon campground and started up the trail. The air was so crisp it felt like it was cutting into my lungs with every breath. And the sky was this deep, endless black with just a sliver of moon peeking through the clouds. Not much light, but enough to see the path if you had a headlamp, which we all did. The ground was covered in about 6 inches of snow, but it wasn't soft or fluffy. It was hard and crusted over, like someone had laid a sheet of ice on top. Every step we took made this loud crunching sound, the kind that echoes in the silence. It was so loud that we had to raise our voices just to hear each other talk. I remember laughing about something, one of my friends joking about how we were probably the only idiots out there in the cold, and another one saying something about how we should have brought hot chocolate. Normal stuff, you know, just guys being dumb and having a good time. We were about an hour and a half into the trail, just below the campground area, where the trees start to get thicker and the canyon walls rise up on either side. It's a spot that feels isolated even in the daytime, but at night it's like you're in another world. The only sounds were our footsteps and our voices, and occasionally the rustle of something in the bushes, probably a deer or a rabbit, nothing big. We'd seen animal tracks earlier, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, this sound ripped through the canyon. I mean, it was deafening. 1 second we're talking and laughing, and the next, this noise just slams into us. It started off like a motorcycle engine, but way louder, and it was echoing from high up in the mountains, like it was coming from everywhere at once. But then it shifted, and that's when my blood went cold. It turned into this mechanical, metallic scream. I don't even know how to describe it properly. It was like metal grinding against metal, but with this raw, animal-like edge to it that made the hair on my arms stand up. The sound lasted for what felt like forever, maybe 15 or 20 seconds, but it seemed longer because it was so intense. It reverberated through the whole back range, filling the air until it was all you could hear. The crunching of our boots stopped, our voices died in our throats, and we all just froze. I remember looking at my friends, and their faces were pale, eyes wide. One of them had his mouth hanging open, like he was about to say something but couldn't. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, and my hands started to tremble. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've been in sketchy situations before, like getting lost on a trail or hearing coyotes howl close by. But this was different. This wasn't an animal sound I recognized. It wasn't a bear or a cougar or anything like that. It was something else, something unnatural. The sound had this force behind it that felt like it was pushing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. As soon as the noise stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. It was so quiet you could hear the blood rushing in your ears. We all stood there for a second, just staring at each other, and then one of my friends whispered, "What the hell was that?" His voice was shaky, and I could see he was gripping his hiking pole like it was a weapon. I shook my head because I had no idea. My mind was racing, trying to place it, maybe a plane or some kind of machinery. But we were in the middle of nowhere, and it was late at night. Who would be running equipment up there? And the sound didn't fade away like an engine would. It just cut off, like someone flipped a switch. That's when I noticed something else. Right after the sound stopped, I saw this faint, whitish mist drift past me. It was about 5 or 6 inches long, just a wispy thing, and it moved quickly into the trees to my left. At first, I thought maybe someone was smoking, but no one was. We'd all quit that habit years ago, and besides, it didn't smell like smoke. It didn't smell like anything, really. It was just there, 1 second, and gone the next, vanishing into the dark. I didn't say anything about it at first because I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but it felt too real. It added to the creepiness of the whole thing, like this was all part of some weird, terrifying puzzle. Then the panic set in. One of my friends, the one who's usually the calmest, suddenly said, "We need to go, now." His voice was tight, and he was already turning around. We didn't even discuss it, we all knew. We started running back down the trail, and I've never moved so fast in my life. The snow was crunching under our feet, but now it sounded like it was chasing us. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes made me jump. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and I could feel the cold air burning in my lungs. But I didn't care. All I could think about was getting out of there. As we ran, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following us. The trees looked darker, more menacing, like they were closing in. My headlamp beam bounced around, casting crazy shadows that made my mind play tricks on me. I thought I saw movement a couple of times, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. But when I looked directly, there was nothing. One of my friends stumbled and almost fell, but he caught himself and kept going without a word. We were all breathing heavy, panting, and I could hear the fear in every gasp. The trail felt longer on the way back, like it had stretched out. Every turn we took, I hoped we'd see the parking lot, but it just kept going. I remember my legs aching from the cold and the effort, but the adrenaline kept me pushing. My hands were numb, and I realized I'd been clenching them into fists so tight that my nails were digging into my palms. We didn't talk the whole way. There was no need. We all knew we'd heard something that shouldn't exist. And that mist I saw just cemented it. It was like the universe had thrown us a curveball, and we were scrambling to get away before it hit us. When we finally reached the parking lot, we didn't stop to catch our breath. We just piled into the car, fumbling with the keys, and slammed the doors shut. The interior light felt too bright, too safe, but I still felt exposed. One of my friends started the engine, and we peeled out of there, the tires slipping a little on the snow. No one spoke for the first few minutes. We just sat there, breathing hard, staring out the windows like we expected something to jump out at us. Once we were on the main road, heading back toward town, the tension started to ease a little, but the fear was still there, sitting in the pit of my stomach. One of my friends finally broke the silence. "Did anyone else see that mist?" he asked, and his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I nodded, and the other two did too. That's when I knew I wasn't crazy. We all saw it, and we all heard that sound. We started trying to make sense of it, throwing out ideas. Maybe it was a rock slide or some kind of industrial noise, but nothing fit. The sound was too organic, too alive, in a way that machinery isn't. And the mist? No explanation for that at all. By the time we got back to our apartment, it was well past midnight, but none of us could sleep. We sat in the living room, drinking water and trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking, and every time I closed my eyes, I could hear that scream echoing in my head. It was like it had burned itself into my memory. We talked about it for hours, going over every detail, but we couldn't come up with anything that made sense. The more we talked, the more it felt like we'd stumbled into something we weren't supposed to see or hear. I've thought about that night a lot since then. I've listened to recordings of animals, bears, cougars, elk, but nothing comes close to what we heard. It wasn't until later, when I was digging around online, that I found Bigfoot audio clips. They weren't an exact match, but they were the closest thing I've ever heard. Just listening to them sent chills down my spine because it brought back that feeling of utter terror. I'm not saying I believe in Sasquatch or anything supernatural, but after that night, I can't rule it out. Whatever it was, it felt ancient and powerful, like something that belonged in those mountains, and we were just intruders. The weirdest part is that mist. I've never seen anything like it before or since. It wasn't fog or steam. It was just this faint whitish wisp that drifted by and disappeared. In the moment, it felt like a sign, like whatever made that sound was marking its territory or something. I don't know. Maybe it was all in our heads, but four people don't hallucinate the same thing at the same time. To this day, I can't go back to that part of the canyon. Even thinking about it makes my skin crawl. My friends feel the same way. We've talked about it a few times over the years, and we all agree that it was the most terrifying experience of our lives. We were young and invincible, or so we thought. But that night humbled us. It reminded me that there are things in this world we don't understand, and maybe we're better off not knowing. I still hike sometimes, but I stick to daytime trails and I never go alone. Every time I hear a strange noise in the woods, my heart skips a beat, and I find myself looking over my shoulder. That sound, that mist, it's stuck with me, like a shadow I can't shake. I don't have any answers, and I probably never will. All I know is that on that cold night in Rock Canyon, we encountered something that defies explanation, and it left us with a dread that lingers even now. Story 3. It was one of those perfect autumn days that make you forget how brutal Utah winters can be. The kind of day where the air is so crisp it feels like you're drinking it, and the sun is warm on your skin but doesn't burn. The leaves in Covered Bridge Canyon were just insane. A firestorm of red and orange and yellow. My wife and I, we'd decided to just get in the Jeep and go. No real plan, just drive down Highway 6 near Spanish Fork Canyon and see where we ended up. We'd been married for 7 years, and these little spontaneous trips were our thing. No kids, just us and the open road. That day felt like a gift. We'd packed a simple lunch, some sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, and just pointed the Jeep east. Most people just pull over on the shoulder of the highway, gawk at the colors for a minute, take a picture, and leave. I've never been one for doing what everyone else does. I'd been down some of the Forest Service roads before, and I remembered that the Sterling Hollow trailhead offered a killer elevated view of the whole canyon. It's a bit of a rougher road, nothing a Jeep Wrangler can't handle, but it weeds out the casual sightseers. I wanted that private, uninterrupted view with my wife, so I turned off the pavement and onto the dirt track. The Jeep bounced gently over the ruts, the dust kicking up behind us in a red cloud. The trees closed in around us, the colors even more intense up close. It was quiet. The kind of quiet you only get deep in the woods, where the only sounds are the crunch of your own tires and the distant call of a bird. We got to the small clearing that serves as the trailhead and parking area. It's just a flat, gravelly spot, big enough for maybe 3 or 4 cars. I pulled in, and, out of habit, I turned the Jeep around so it was facing back down the road we came in on. It's a hunter's thing, I guess. Always be ready for a quick exit. I shut off the engine, and the silence that rushed in was absolute. It was heavy. We got out and stood by the hood for a minute, just taking it all in. The view was even better than I remembered. You could see for miles down the canyon, a river of gold and crimson flowing between the dark green of the pine trees. I put my arm around my wife's shoulders, and she leaned into me. It should have been perfect, but it wasn't. I can't tell you when the feeling started. Exactly. It wasn't a switch flipping. It was a slow creep, like a drop in temperature you feel in your bones before your skin registers it. The beautiful silence started to feel thick, oppressive. The hair on my arms stood up. I remember rubbing my hands over them, thinking I was just chilled, but the sun was still warm. This was a different kind of cold. I looked at my wife. Her smile had faded. She was staring out into the trees, not at the scenic view, but into the dense oak brush that bordered the small, grassy flat in front of our Jeep. Her body was tense. "You okay?" I asked. She didn't look at me. She just shook her head slightly. "I don't know. I don't like it here anymore." That was all she said, but it was enough. My wife is tough. She's not a nervous person. She's the one who checks for spiders in the basement and kills them without a flinch. For her to say that, with that tone of voice, a low, almost whispered urgency, it set every one of my nerves on edge. The feeling of wrongness I'd been trying to ignore suddenly had a voice. "Let's just get back in the car," she said, her eyes still fixed on that oak brush. "Yeah, okay," I said, my own voice feeling too loud in the quiet. I walked her around to the passenger side, my own senses now screaming. I felt exposed. The clearing that had felt so private and peaceful minutes ago now felt like a trap, with the woods pressing in from all sides. I opened the door for her and she practically slid inside, pulling the door shut behind her with a solid thunk that was way too loud. I hurried around to the driver's side, my boots crunching on the gravel. Each step felt like it took an hour. I yanked the door open, slid into the seat and pulled the door closed. The interior of the Jeep felt safer. A metal and glass cocoon. My heart was thumping in my chest, a steady, heavy drumbeat. I reached for the keys, my hand going to the ignition to start the engine and get us the hell out of there. That's when I saw her face. She was frozen, not like someone who's scared, but like someone who's been turned to stone. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, locked on something through the windshield. Her knuckles were white, where she was gripping the edge of her seat. She wasn't breathing. I don't think she was even blinking. "Honey?" I said, my hand pausing on the keys. She didn't respond, didn't move a muscle. My own eyes followed her line of sight across the small grassy flat, maybe 50, 60 yards in front of us. The flat was dotted with a few scrub oaks, and then it gave way to a much denser patch of oak trees, the kind that are tangled and thick, and you can't see more than a few feet into them. And then I saw it. Movement. Fast. Impossibly fast. A shape, tall and black and covered in what looked like shaggy hair, erupted from the grass at the edge of the flat and bolted for the dense oak trees. It was huge. It had to be at least 6 feet tall, but it was hunched over, moving in a powerful, fluid lope. It wasn't running on all fours like a bear. It was running on 2 legs, its long arms pumping. The speed was what got me. It covered the distance from the center of the flat to the tree line in maybe 2-3 seconds. It was just a blur of dark, powerful motion. Then it was gone, vanished into the wall of oak brush without a sound. No cracking branches, no rustling leaves. Nothing. It was just there, and then it wasn't. The whole sighting lasted less than 5 seconds, but every millisecond is burned into my brain. The way its shoulders were rounded, the sheer mass of it, the darkness of its fur against the bright yellow grass. It moved with a raw, primal power that sucked the air right out of my lungs. I sat there, my hand still hovering over the ignition, my mouth hanging open. I slowly turned my head to look at my wife. She was still frozen, but a single tear had traced a path down her cheek. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. She finally moved, a slow, stiff nod. Her eyes were still glued to the spot where it had disappeared. What was that?" I stammered. My mind was scrambling, trying to find a box to put this thing in. A bear? Was it a bear? A moose? Maybe a black cow got loose from a farm? It sounded stupid even as I said it. We were miles from any farm, and cows don't move like that. Nothing moves like that. She slowly, deliberately shook her head. Her voice, when it finally came, was flat and certain, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of someone stating a simple, terrifying fact. It was a Bigfoot. A cold dread, colder than anything I'd felt outside, washed over me. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. I just didn't want it to be true. "I've been watching it," she said, her voice still that awful monotone whisper. "Since I got in the car, it was standing there, at the tree line, just watching us. It was standing up. Then when you got in, it moved." My blood ran cold. She'd been watching it the whole time. That thing had been standing there, observing us while I was fumbling with the car door, while I was feeling spooked for no good reason. It had been there, and then it had moved, and the speed of it was a display of pure, unadulterated power. A message, a warning. That was it. I didn't need any more convincing. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, shattering the silence. I didn't even bother with my seatbelt. I threw the Jeep into drive and stomped on the gas. The tires spun on the gravel for a second before catching, and we shot forward down the dirt road. I didn't look back. I drove too fast, the Jeep bouncing violently over the ruts, my hands clenched on the steering wheel. I didn't say a word, neither did she. We just drove, the image of that dark, speeding figure seared behind our eyes. The rest of the day was a blur. We got home, we didn't talk about it, we just went through the motions, but the air in our house was different. We were both jumpy, starting at small noises. We kept looking out the windows. The comfortable world we knew had just been proven to have a massive, terrifying hole in it. But as the hours wore on, a different feeling started to grow in me alongside the fear. Curiosity, a deep, gnawing need to know. I'm a hunter. I've spent my whole life in these mountains. I track deer and elk. I know what every animal in this state looks like, how it moves, what its tracks are like. What I saw was none of them. It was something else, and I had to know. So later that evening, as the sun was starting to dip below the peaks, casting long, deep shadows, I told my wife I was going back out. Her face went pale. She begged me not to go, but I had to. I grabbed my hunting rifle, a .3006, enough to stop just about anything in North America, my backpack with a powerful flashlight, and my knife. It wasn't about hunting it. It was about proof, about understanding. The drive back felt completely different. The beautiful canyon was now just a dark, menacing place. Every shadow seemed to move. I pulled back into the Sterling Hollow trailhead, the gravel crunching under my tires, sounding like a gunshot in the evening quiet. I parked in the exact same spot. I sat there for a minute, engine running, just listening. Nothing. The same heavy, watchful silence. I got out, rifle in hand, the strap slung over my shoulder. The air was cold now. I could see my breath. I walked slowly towards the grassy flat, my boots making soft sounds on the damp earth. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was stupid. This was the most stupid thing I had ever done. I walked to the spot, the general area where I'd seen the thing vanish into the oak trees. The grass was trampled, not like by a deer or an elk, which usually leaves a neat path. This was different. It was a mess. A large area of grass was flattened and torn up, as if something very heavy and powerful had been standing there, shifting its weight and then launched itself forward. My mouth was dry. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting a stark white path through the deepening twilight. I pushed my way into the oak brush. It was tough going, the branches scraping at my jacket, pulling at my rifle. I shined the light on the ground. The leaf litter was disturbed, not just scattered but kicked up. There were places where the damp, dark soil was exposed, gouged. I got down on one knee, shining the light at a low angle, looking for a clear print. But the ground was a mess of leaves and roots and small rocks. There was no clear, definitive track, no perfect cast you could take to a museum. But there were impressions, dark patches in the soil that suggested something massive had stepped there. And then I saw the branches. Some of the oak branches, as thick as my thumb, were snapped, not chewed, not broken by weather. They were snapped clean, about 4.5, 5 feet off the ground. Something very tall and very strong had pushed its way through here in a tremendous hurry. I stood up, my knees popping. I shone the flashlight beam deeper into the trees. The beam only penetrated a dozen feet or so before it was swallowed by the utter blackness. I felt it then. That same feeling from earlier, the feeling of being watched. It was a physical pressure on the back of my neck. The woods were no longer silent. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I could hear my own ragged breathing. I was alone in the dark, in a place where something that shouldn't exist did. I had my rifle, but it felt like a toy. What good would a bullet do against something that could move with that kind of speed and power? Something that could vanish without a sound. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, frozen in that beam of light, surrounded by a wall of blackness. I was looking for answers, but all I found was a deeper, more profound fear. The fear that comes from knowing you are not at the top of the food chain. The fear that comes from touching the edge of a mystery so vast and so unknown that it rewrites your understanding of the world. I finally backed out of the thicket, my light swinging wildly, expecting to see those huge, dark shapes moving between the trees. I practically ran back to the Jeep, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the tree line, the engine running, the heater blowing warm air that did nothing to cut the chill in my soul. I never went back, not to that spot. We still go out to see the leaves, but we stay on the main highway now with the other tourists. I'm an experienced hunter. I know the woods. I know what belongs there and what doesn't. What I saw that day didn't belong. It was no bear, no moose, no man in a suit. It was something else, something old and powerful and real. And sometimes late at night when the wind is just right, I can still feel it watching me from the edges of my own memory, a towering black figure moving with impossible speed, forever just out of sight. Story 4. That night was no different at the start. We found our spot, a little pull-off a few miles down a logging road, surrounded by these huge ponderosa pines. The air was cool and clean, smelled like pine sap and dust. We set up the mattress, cracked open a couple of beers, and just talked for hours, watching the stars come out until we finally drifted off. I remember thinking as I fell asleep how quiet it was. Not just quiet, but a heavy, deep quiet, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I woke up because the quiet was gone. It wasn't a sudden noise that jolted me awake. It was a sound that had already been happening for a while, I think, and my brain just finally registered it as wrong. A slow, heavy crunch, crunch, crunch. On the dry pine needles that carpeted the ground around the truck, my eyes snapped open. The world was pitch black outside the truck bed's canopy. The little battery-powered LED lantern we'd left on was dead. I lay perfectly still, listening. My friend was next to me, and I could feel his body go rigid too. He was awake. "Bear," he whispered, so quiet it was barely a breath. It made sense. We were in bear country. We'd stored our food properly, locked in the cab, but maybe something had attracted one. I felt a spike of adrenaline, the kind you get when you know there's a large, wild animal nearby, but it was a familiar fear, manageable. We both had our handguns in the bedside organizers we'd rigged up, a .45 for him, a 9mm for me. We weren't cowboys, just cautious. The crunching kept going. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause, crunch. It was circling the truck. I could track it by sound. It went from the driver's side, past the tailgate, over to the passenger side, and then back around. A slow, deliberate circuit. But then I noticed the rhythm was off. A bear, even a big one, doesn't walk that slow. It's more of a lumbering shuffle. This was different. It was a steady, purposeful step, step, step. Like it was taking its time, like it was considering the truck, considering us. That's when the smell hit me. It started as a faint whiff, something rotten on the breeze. Then it got stronger, flooding the enclosed space of the truck bed. It was a thick, heavy stench, a mix of rotting meat, wet fur, and something else, something foul and gamey. It was a smell I knew. My family's Labrador got into a fight with a coyote once, and by the time we found him, he was hurt and terrified. He had this same exact smell clinging to him, the smell of a frightened, injured animal, mixed with blood and dirt and panic. This was that smell, but 100 times stronger, so potent it made my eyes water and my stomach clench. This was not a bear. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up. It was a physical reaction, completely involuntary. My heart wasn't just pounding anymore. It was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack one. I could feel the vibration of it in my throat. I slowly, so slowly it felt like my joints were rusted shut, turned my head to look at my friend. In the sliver of faint moonlight coming through the canopy's rear window, I could see his eyes, wide and white with terror. He smelled it too. He knew. The footsteps kept circling. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. We were both armed, but the thought of moving, of even shifting my weight to reach for my gun, was unthinkable. It felt like any movement, any sound from us, would be like ringing a dinner bell. We were frozen, two grown men, locked in a paralysis of pure, undiluted fear. We were hiding under a thin sheet and a fiberglass canopy, and it felt like we were in a paper box, completely exposed. Then the grunting started. It was a low, guttural sound coming from deep in its chest. It wasn't loud, but it carried a vibration I could feel in my teeth. It wasn't an aggressive sound, not a growl. It was contemplative, curious. It would grunt, then pause, then take another step. Grunt, crunch, pause. My hand was maybe 6 inches from my 9mm, but it might as well have been a mile away. My fingers were tingling with the need to grab it, to feel the cold, hard weight of it in my hand, but my brain was screaming at me to stay still. Don't let it know you're here. Don't let it know you're alive. That's when the branch snapping started. It wasn't the random crack of a twig underfoot. This was different. We heard a loud snap from the trees to our left, the sound of a good-sized branch breaking. It was too loud, too sharp. A few seconds later, after another slow circle, there was another snap from the right side. It was like it was breaking them on purpose, not to clear a path, but to make a point, to show us its strength, to show us it was there. The smell would get stronger and weaker as it moved around the truck. When it was near the tailgate, the stench was so thick I had to breathe through my mouth, tasting the rot in the back of my throat. I felt like I was going to vomit, but I was too scared to even do that. I just swallowed it down, my body trembling uncontrollably. Time lost all meaning. It felt like we were trapped in that truck for an eternity. My muscles were screaming from being clenched so tight. My jaw ached. I had to pee so badly it was a physical pain, but there was no way I was moving. We just lay there, listening to the slow, deliberate footsteps, the low grunts, the occasional, terrifyingly loud snap of a branch. I kept trying to see it. I'd stare into the blackness past the canopy windows, my eyes straining until they hurt, hoping for a shape, a silhouette, anything, but there was nothing. Just impenetrable darkness and the sounds and the smell of something that shouldn't exist. My mind was racing, trying to put a name to it, trying to find a logical explanation, and coming up completely empty. This was beyond any animal I knew of. This was something else. The worst part was the feeling of being watched. It's a cliché, I know, but I felt it. It was a palpable pressure, a sense that this thing knew exactly where we were, what we were, and that it was just inspecting us. We were insects in a jar. The vulnerability was absolute. We were in a metal cage on wheels, and I have never felt more trapped or helpless in my entire life. The peak of the terror came maybe an hour in. The footsteps stopped right next to the driver's side of the truck, so close I could hear its breathing. It was a wet, rasping sound, like air being pulled through a clogged pipe. The smell was at its worst, a solid wall of foulness. I could feel the heat of my own breath bouncing back from the canopy wall onto my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. I remember a single, clear, stupid thought cutting through the panic. I hope the truck doesn't rock. If the truck rocks, I'm going to scream. It didn't rock. After what felt like a lifetime, the footsteps started again, moving away, continuing their slow, endless circle. This went on and on. I don't know how long. Later, we pieced together it was about an hour and a half, but in that truck it felt like a decade. Slowly, gradually, the sounds began to change. The footsteps moved further away, the grunts became more infrequent. The smell began to lessen, fading from a suffocating blanket to a nasty odor, and then to just a hint on the air. It was moving off, heading southwest, back into the deeper woods. We didn't move a muscle. We lay there, listening as the sounds faded completely until the only thing we could hear was the frantic thumping of our own hearts and the ragged sound of our own breathing. The forest was quiet again, but the silence was now just as terrifying as the noise had been. Was it gone? Was it waiting? Was it just out there watching us from the trees? We waited like that until the first hint of grey light began to seep through the canopy windows. It was the longest wait of my life. Every little night sound, a rustle of leaves, the call of an owl, made me jump. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Finally, when the world outside was a solid, dull grey, we moved. We moved together, a silent, mutual agreement. We sat up, our bodies stiff and aching. We looked at each other. His face was pale, covered in a sheen of cold sweat. I'm sure mine looked the same. We didn't say a word. We just slowly, carefully climbed out of the truck bed. The morning air was cold and clean, a relief after the stench-filled hours. The first thing we did was look at the ground around the truck. The pine needles were a mess. All around the vehicle, in a perfect wide circle, the bed of brown needles was disturbed. They weren't kicked up or scattered wildly, like a deer might do. They were pressed down, as if by something very heavy, in a clear, continuous path that went all the way around our truck. Then we saw the branches. A few small ones were broken off near the truck. but it was the one about 15 feet away that made my blood run cold. It was a live pine branch, thick as my wrist, snapped clean in half. The break was fresh, oozing sap, and it was high. I walked over to it. The broken end was about 6 feet off the ground. Whatever did that had to be tall, really tall. We searched for tracks, our eyes scanning the dirt and needles, but the ground was too dry, too covered in that thick layer of needles. There were no clear prints, nothing we could point a camera at, just that circle of pressed down needles and a broken branch 6 feet in the air. We packed up our stuff in a frantic, silent hurry. We didn't speak until the truck was started. We were turned around, and we were bouncing back down that logging road at twice the speed we'd come in. The drive back to Reading was quiet. We tried to talk about it once we hit the pavement, but our words came out in fragments. What the hell was that? Did you hear the breathing? The smell? We couldn't finish a sentence. We just kept shaking our heads. Back in town, we told a few people. My friend told his brother, who just laughed. I told my dad. My dad has hunted every square mile of this state for 50 years. He's seen bears, mountain lions, you name it. I described the slow steps, the smell, the grunting, the broken branch. I watched his face. He didn't laugh. He just listened, his brow furrowed. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I don't know, son," he finally said, and he looked genuinely unsettled. "I've never heard of anything like that. That was 5 years ago. I still go camping. I still love the woods, but I will not, under any circumstances, be on that mountain after dark. I don't care if it's a beautiful summer day, if the sun is starting to set. I'm gone. The memory of that night is still right there, just under the surface. I can close my eyes and be right back in that truck bed, frozen in fear, listening to those slow, deliberate steps circling us in the dark, and my stomach still tightens into a hard, cold knot every single time. I don't know what it was. I don't have an explanation. I just know what I heard, what I smelled, and what I felt, and that's enough for me." Story 5. It was a hot day in August of 1837, and I was out in the woods near southwest Bridgewater, picking berries. I remember the sun beating down on my back, making my shirt stick to my skin with sweat. The air was thick and heavy, like it does in late summer, and the only sounds were the buzz of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves under my feet. I'd been at it for a couple of hours, filling my basket with blackberries from the thickets that grew wild along the edge of the forest. It was something I did most days when the berries were ripe, a way to pass the time and have something sweet to eat later. I wasn't thinking about anything out of the ordinary, just focusing on not getting pricked by the thorns and keeping an eye out for snakes. The area was mostly open fields with patches of woods, and I was in a spot where the trees started to get denser. I could see the old stone wall that marked the property line, and beyond that, the land sloped down toward a creek that was mostly dry that time of year. I was bent over, my fingers stained purple from the berries, when I first heard it, a whistling sound. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe a bird, but it was too steady, too melodic. It sounded like a person whistling a tune, but there was no one around for miles. I straightened up, my back aching from crouching, and looked around. Nothing moved except for a few leaves stirring in the breeze. I shrugged it off and went back to picking, but the whistling didn't stop. It was faint but clear, coming from deeper in the woods. It was a strange, eerie melody, not like any song I knew, and it sent a little chill down my spine, even though the day was warm. I remember thinking maybe it was some kid playing a prank, but who would be out here alone? I decided to ignore it and keep working, but my hands were starting to feel clumsy, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The sound was getting a bit louder, like whatever was making it was moving closer. Then I saw it. Through the trees about 50 yards away, there was a figure. At first I thought it was a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old because of the size. But as it stepped into a patch of sunlight, I realized it was all wrong. It was walking upright like a person, but it was slimmer than any kid I'd ever seen, and its whole body was covered in dark, matted hair. Not fur like an animal, but more like thick, shaggy hair that hung off it in clumps. Its arms were long and swung slightly as it moved, and its legs were skinny, almost bony. The face, I couldn't see it clearly at first, but it had a human-like shape, except it was hairy too, and the eyes were dark and set deep, and it was whistling that same tune, low and steady, like it didn't have a care in the world. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I froze, my basket half full of berries, and just stared. I'd heard stories about wild things in the woods, but I never put much stock in them. This was different. This was real, and it was right there. The creature stopped walking and turned its head toward me. I don't know if it saw me or not, but the whistling paused for a second, and then it started again. It took a step in my direction, and that's when the fear really hit me. My stomach clenched, and I felt cold sweat break out on my forehead, even though the sun was blazing. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. It kept coming closer, moving slowly but deliberately. I could see more details now, the way its hair moved with each step, the slight sway of its body. It wasn't running or acting aggressive, but there was something unnatural about it that made my skin crawl. The whistling was louder now, and it sounded almost cheerful, which made it even creepier. I'd thought about shouting or throwing something, but my voice was stuck in my throat. All I could do was watch as it closed the distance between us. It was maybe 30 yards away now, and I could see its eyes better. They were dark and shiny like wet stones, and they seemed to be fixed on me. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually the shock wore off enough that I could move. I took a step back, and the creature stopped. It tilted its head like a dog listening, and the whistling cut off. For a moment, everything was silent except for the buzzing of flies and the thumping of my heart. Then it let out a soft, almost human-like sigh and started moving toward me again. That's when I snapped out of it. I dropped my basket, berries scattering everywhere, and turned to run. But as I did, I stumbled over a root and fell hard on my hands and knees. The pain shot up my arms, and I scrambled back up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I looked back, the creature was still there watching me. It hadn't run away or attacked. It just stood there, whistling that same tune again. Something about its calmness made me angry, or maybe it was the fear turning into adrenaline. I don't know why, but instead of running away, I decided to go after it. I know it sounds crazy, but in that moment, I needed to know what it was. I took a deep breath, wiped the dirt off my hands, and started walking toward it. The creature didn't move at first, it just kept whistling. But as I got closer, maybe 20 yards away, it turned and started to walk away, still whistling. I picked up my pace, breaking into a jog. The ground was uneven with roots and rocks, and I had to watch my step. The creature was moving faster now, but it wasn't running, just walking quickly, its slender body weaving through the trees with an ease that seemed impossible. I pushed myself to run faster, my lungs burning from the effort. The whistling was ahead of me, guiding me like a beacon, and I followed it, my eyes fixed on that hairy back. I could see the muscles moving under the hair, and the way its feet barely made a sound on the forest floor. It was like it was gliding, not walking. Then, all of a sudden, it broke into a run, and I mean it ran like nothing I'd ever seen. It wasn't just fast, it was unbelievably fast, like the devil himself was chasing it. That's what I thought in that moment, and that's what I called it later. Its legs moved in a blur, and it covered ground so quickly that within seconds it was pulling away from me. I sprinted after it, my heart hammering against my ribs, but it was no use. The whistling grew fainter as it disappeared into the trees, and soon I couldn't hear it at all. I kept running for a few more minutes until my side ached, and I had to stop, doubling over to catch my breath. I stood there, panting, in the middle of the woods. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows, and the air was starting to cool. I looked around, but there was no sign of the creature, no tracks, no sound, nothing. It was like it had vanished into thin air. I felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relief that it was gone, but frustration that I hadn't been able to catch it or get a better look. My hands were shaking, and I realized I was covered in sweat and dirt. I started walking back to where I'd dropped my basket, my mind racing. What was that thing? Was it some kind of animal? But it walked upright and whistled like a person. It didn't make any sense. When I got back to the berry patch, my basket was still there, tipped over with berries spilled everywhere. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and started gathering what I could. The whole time I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see it again. But the woods were quiet now, too quiet. The normal sounds, birds, insects, seemed muted like they were holding their breath. I finished picking up the berries and headed home, walking quickly, my eyes darting around every shadow. The image of that hairy, childlike creature was burned into my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching me. By the time I got back to my cabin, the sun was setting and the sky was turning orange and purple. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I'd seen a bear or something, and my mind had played tricks on me. But I knew that wasn't true. Bears don't walk upright like that, and they don't whistle. I tried to put it out of my head, but that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The way it moved, the sound of its whistling. I lay in bed, listening to the night sounds outside, and every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I kept thinking about what it could be, and why it was out there. Was it alone? Was there more of them? The next day I went back to the spot with a couple of neighbors, but we didn't find anything. No tracks, no hair, nothing. They thought I was crazy, or that I'd had too much sun. I didn't blame them. I would have thought the same thing if I hadn't seen it myself. But I knew what I saw, and I couldn't let it go. For weeks afterward, I'd go out into the woods, hoping to see it again, but I never did. Sometimes, though, when the wind was just right, I'd hear a faint whistling in the distance and my blood would run cold. I'd stop whatever I was doing and listen, but it would always fade away before I could pinpoint where it was coming from. That experience haunted me for years. I'd be going about my day, and suddenly the memory would hit me like a physical blow. The sight of that hairy thing, the sound of its whistling, the way it ran off like it was nothing. I told the story a few times to people who'd listen, but most just shrugged it off or laughed. They'd say it was food for the marvelous, something to talk about around the fire, but with no foundation to prove it. And they were right. I had no proof. No one else ever saw it as far as I know, but I persisted in declaring what I'd seen because I knew it was real. It wasn't a dream or a hallucination. It was there, in the flesh, and it left me with a fear that never really went away. Even now, all these years later, I can close my eyes and see it clear as day. The way it stood there, whistling, like it belonged in those woods more than I did. And that run, so fast it was like it wasn't even touching the ground. I never found out what it was, and I doubt I ever will. But I know what I saw, and it's something that stayed with me, a mystery that's never been solved. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods alone, I'll stop and listen, half hoping and half dreading to hear that whistling again. But it's always just the wind or a bird or nothing at all, and I'm left with the memory and the chill that never quite goes away. Story 6. Okay, I'm just going to type this out. I've never posted anything like this before, but I found this forum and I've been reading stories for a few weeks now, and I guess I need to get mine out there. Maybe someone will believe me. Maybe someone else has seen the same thing. I don't know. It's been over a decade, but I still think about it all the time. It's one of those memories that just sits there, in the back of your mind. And every now and then it pops up and the fear feels fresh again. This happened back in October of 2011. I was living in southern Illinois at the time, not far from the little town of Olive Branch in Alexander County. I'm a photographer, or I was trying to be back then, and I spent a lot of my free time hiking around with my camera gear, trying to get shots of the fall colors. The forests down there are something else in October. All these deep reds and bright yellows, and the air has that crisp, clean smell of dead leaves and damp earth. That particular day, it was a Tuesday, I think. It was one of those perfect, clear autumn days where the sky is so blue it almost doesn't look real. I decided to explore a ridge trail that ran off Illinois Route 3. It wasn't a marked park trail or anything, just a path worn into the dirt by hunters and maybe a few other hikers. I'd parked my beat-up old sedan on the gravel shoulder of the road, grabbed my backpack with my camera, a couple lenses, a water bottle, and a sandwich, and headed in. The trail climbed pretty quickly up the ridge. The trees were thick, a mix of oaks and hickories and sycamores down near the bottom where it was wetter. The sunlight came through the canopy in these long, slanting shafts, lighting up patches of the forest floor. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get deep in the woods. Just the crunch of my own boots on the dry leaves, the distant call of a crow, the rustle of a squirrel somewhere. I remember feeling good, peaceful. I was alone, but it was the good kind of alone. You know, just me and the trees. I'd been walking for maybe 45 minutes, following the spine of the ridge, when I decided to take a break. I found a flat rock to sit on, took a swig of water and just listened. That's when I saw it, a little off to the side of the trail, in a patch of soft, dark mud near a seep spring, was a footprint. It wasn't a deer track or a bear print. I'd seen those before. This was different. It was huge. I mean, ridiculously huge. My first stupid thought was that some joker had come out here with a big wooden stamp or something, but that made no sense. Who would do that way out here? I got up from the rock and walked over to it, my curiosity totally taking over. I knelt down beside it. The mud was still damp, so it hadn't been there too long. The print was clear, with defined toes. I remember that specifically. It wasn't just a blob. You could see the outline of 5 toes. I pulled out my camera, thinking this was a crazy thing to get a picture of. I didn't have a ruler or anything, so I put my boot right next to it for scale and took a shot. My boot was a size 10, and this thing absolutely dwarfed it. Later, when I was trying to make sense of it all, I measured the length against my boot and figured it had to be at least 19 inches long. 19 inches, from the back of the heel to the tip of the biggest toe. It was just staggering. A few feet away from the print, there was a pile of scat. It was big too, and full of what looked like chewed up plant matter and bits of shell. I poked at it with a stick and saw what I'm pretty sure were crayfish shells. That made sense. There were creeks all through those bottoms. I took a picture of that too, with my boot for scale again. I remember feeling a little thrill, like I'd found something weird and cool. My mind wasn't going to monsters or anything. I was just thinking, what the hell kind of animal leaves a sign like this? Maybe a really, really big bear, but the print didn't look right for a bear. The toes were different. I stood up, slinging my camera back over my shoulder, and took a few more steps along the trail, my eyes scanning the ground now, looking for more signs. The ridge started to curve around to the left, and the trees thinned out a bit, letting more of the afternoon sun through. I took maybe 5-6 steps, and then I saw him. He was about 70, maybe 80 feet away, down the slope from me, standing partly behind the thick trunk of a big sycamore tree. He wasn't completely hidden, just sort of positioned behind it, like he'd been watching me. My brain just stopped. It literally could not process what I was seeing. It was a figure, a huge, solid figure. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was built like a powerlifter, just massively broad across the chest and shoulders, with these long, thick arms. And it was covered in hair, dark brown hair, but with this distinct reddish tint to it, like a rusty color, especially where the sun hit it. The sun was behind me, so it was lighting him up from the front. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, and I was just standing there, frozen. I couldn't even breathe. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the world. My heart wasn't just pounding. It felt like it was trying to hammer its way out of my ribcage. This wasn't curiosity or thrill anymore. This was pure, undiluted terror. A deep, primal fear that came from a place inside me I didn't even know existed. Every hair on my body stood up. My skin went cold and tight. Our eyes met. I couldn't see the details of his face from that distance, but I could see the shape of his head, kind of cone-shaped, and I knew he was looking right at me. Then he moved. He didn't lurch or shuffle. He just started coming toward me, and he didn't run at first. It was this purposeful, powerful walk, but his walk was like my sprint. In 3 strides, 3 long, fluid, effortless strides, he closed half the distance between us. 1 second he was 70 feet away, and in the space of a single choked breath, he was 35, 40 feet away and still coming. That was the terror moment. That's the part that plays in my nightmares, the sheer impossible speed of it, the power in those movements. He moved like a force of nature, like a landslide starting. There was no hesitation, no noise. It was utterly silent. No heavy footfalls, no cracking twigs, nothing. My body unlocked. Pure instinct took over. I think I let out a gasp, a tiny, strangled sound. I stumbled back a step, my arms flailing for balance, sure I was about to die. I was convinced that in another 2 of those strides, he would be on top of me. But he didn't. He stopped. He was just standing there again, maybe 35 feet away now. He was close enough that I could see the musculature under the hair, the way his chest moved as he breathed. He tilted his head slightly, and then, in one smooth motion, he turned away from me. He didn't look back. He just ran. He ran down the steep slope of the ridge away from me, and I don't mean he scrambled or slid. He ran. His speed was breathtaking, literally. It was like watching water flow downhill. He took the steep, tangled, rocky slope like it was a flat track. He didn't slow down. He didn't stumble. His legs just ate up the ground. He hit the bottom of the ravine and powered right up the other side, up the next ridge, which was just as steep. He moved through the thick underbrush like it wasn't even there, his body weaving between trees with an agility that made no sense for something that big. And the whole time, it was almost completely silent. The only sound was this faint, soft whoof, whoof, whoof of his feet on the forest floor, a sound no louder than a squirrel makes jumping through the leaves. I stood there, frozen again, watching this massive, impossibly fast creature vanish into the trees on the opposite ridge. In a matter of seconds, he was just gone. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before. My ears were ringing. I was still clutching the strap of my camera bag, my knuckles white. I was trembling all over, a fine, uncontrollable shake. My mouth was so dry I couldn't swallow. I felt dizzy, and for a second I thought I might throw up. I just stood there, staring at the empty space where he'd been, trying to get my brain to catch up with what my eyes had just seen. It couldn't be real, but the fear was real. The cold sweat soaking my shirt was real. The memory of that reddish-brown hair glowing in the sun was burned into my mind. My survival instinct finally kicked in again, louder this time. Get out now! I turned around, my legs feeling like wet noodles, and I started half walking, half stumbling back the way I came. I wasn't thinking about my photos or my sandwich or anything. I was just moving, fueled by pure adrenaline. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there again, but the forest was empty. As I hurried back along the trail, my mind was racing, trying to find an explanation. A bear in a weird fur coat, a person in a suit. It was all ridiculous. No suit moves like that. No person is that big and that fast. No bear has that kind of build or that color hair, or moves in complete silence. Then I saw it, and I stopped dead in my tracks. Right near where I'd found the big footprint, there was a hole in the ground at the base of a tree. It was a ground nest for hornets or yellow jackets. The nest was torn open, the papery outer shell ripped apart. It was empty, cleaned out, and it hit me. The scat I'd seen, full of vegetable matter and crayfish shells, and probably insect parts. He wasn't coming for me. He'd been coming through me, toward the hornet nest. I was just in the way. The realization didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made it worse. This wasn't some mythical monster on a hunt. It was a real, living thing, going about its business, foraging for food, and I had blundered into its space. I didn't stop to take more pictures. I just ran. I ran the rest of the way back to the car, my heart pounding in my throat, my backpack slamming against my back. Every shadow looked like a moving shape. Every rustle of leaves sounded like those silent, powerful footsteps. I burst out of the tree line onto the gravel shoulder of Route 3, gasping for air. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and just sat there for a full 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. I drove home in a daze. When I got back to my apartment, the first thing I did was pull out my camera, my hands still trembling. I was going to look at the pictures of the footprint and the scat, proof of what I'd seen. I scrolled through the images on the little screen. There was the shot of the fall colors. There was the one of the trail. My heart sank. I kept scrolling. The last picture was from before I'd even found the print. In my panic, when I'd stumbled backwards, I must have hit the delete button. The images were gone. I'd erased the only physical evidence I had. I never went back to that ridge. I told one friend about it a few days later, and he just laughed and said I'd probably seen a big buck deer, and my imagination had run wild. I didn't try to convince him. What was the point? But I know what I saw. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It was something else. Something solid and real and powerful beyond anything I'd ever known. The memory of it moving toward me, the sheer silent speed of it, the way its reddish hair seemed to glow. That's what stays with me. That's what I can't explain. That's what haunts me. It's been years, and I still can't explain it. Story 7. I pulled into my driveway right around 1 in the morning. Dead quiet. The kind of quiet you only get out here, miles from the nearest streetlight. My headlights cut across the front of the house, then swept over the tree line as I turned to park in my usual spot. I kill the engine, and the silence just swallows you whole. It's not an empty silence, though. Out here, it's always full of little things. Crickets, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. It's a living silence. I'm used to it. I grew up with it. I sat there for a second, just letting my eyes adjust to the dark. The interior light of the truck had clicked off, and I was fumbling for my keys on the passenger seat when I heard it. It wasn't a sound I knew. That was the first thing that hit me. I know every damn sound these woods make. I know the screech of a fox, the scream of a rabbit, the grunt of a deer. This was different. It started as a low, rumbling grunt. Deep, so deep, I felt it in my chest, more than I heard it with my ears. It was the sound a bear might make if a bear was the size of a small car and had a chest full of rocks. And then it rose, twisting into this long, drawn-out howl that wasn't like a coyote's. A coyote's howl is high and lonesome. This was lower, guttural, and it had this weird, almost human quality to it, like a shout that had been stretched and distorted. It was a howl mixed with a roar, and it came from the woods right behind my house, maybe a couple 100 yards in. The sound just froze me. My hand was still on the keys and I couldn't move. It wasn't just the strangeness of it, it was the intent behind it. It didn't sound like an animal just making noise. It sounded like a statement, a challenge. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I don't know why I did it. It was stupid. Maybe it was just pure, dumb curiosity, the same instinct that makes you poke a dead thing with a stick. I rolled my window down a crack, just an inch or two. I took a breath, and I mimicked the sound. Not loud, Not a full-blown shout. I just tried to recreate that low grunt and the rising howl as best I could. It came out weak and pathetic. A poor imitation, but it was close enough in tone. The response was instantaneous. It wasn't from the same spot. This one came from my left, from the thicker part of the woods that runs along the edge of my property, and it was closer, a lot closer, maybe 100 yards, if that. This sound wasn't a statement. It was pure, raw anger. It was the same basic structure, that deep grunt building into a howl, but it was sharper, louder, and it cracked through the silence like a physical blow. It was a reply, a direct, pissed-off reply to my stupid little noise. It wasn't just answering, it was telling me to shut the hell up. That's when the fear really set in. Not just a little jump scare, but a deep, primal fear that starts in your gut and floods your whole system. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. My mouth went dry. I wasn't just hearing one weird animal. There were at least two of them, and one of them was now between me and my house. I keep a pistol in my truck, a 9mm, in a locked box under the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so bad I fumbled the little key, dropping it on the floor mat. I cursed, my voice a ragged whisper, and scrambled for it, my ears straining for any other sound. I finally got the box open, my fingers clumsy and thick. The weight of the gun in my hand was familiar, a small, cold comfort, but it felt ridiculously small all of a sudden. I chambered around as quietly as I could, the sound absurdly loud in the cab. I pushed the door open slowly, trying not to make a sound. The dome light didn't come on. I disabled it years ago for exactly this kind of situation, coming home late without waking the whole house. I was grateful for that now. I stepped out onto the gravel, my boots crunching softly. Every tiny sound I made felt like a scream. I started backing towards the house, which was about 50 feet away. My eyes were glued to the tree line, scanning the impenetrable blackness between the trunks. The porch light was on, casting a weak yellow puddle on the front steps, but it didn't reach the woods. The darkness there was absolute. I took a step back, then another. I held the gun in a two-handed grip, pointed at the ground, but ready. My arms were tense, my shoulders tight up around my ears. Then another howl came. From my right, this time, a third one. It was different again, slightly higher in pitch, more of a wail, but with the same powerful chest-rumbling undertone. It was further away than the angry one, but it was another voice, a third voice in the dark. They were talking to each other, or talking about me. My backpedaling turned into a shuffle, then almost a jog. I couldn't keep my eyes on all the directions at once. The woods to the left, where the angry one was. The woods to the right, where the new one had called from. The deep woods straight ahead, where the first one had been. I felt surrounded. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. The cool night air felt like ice in my lungs. I was maybe 20 feet from the porch steps when I heard a sound that wasn't a howl. It was a heavy, rhythmic thump, 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 like someone hitting a tree with a giant sledgehammer. It was coming from the left, from the angry one's direction. Each impact was solid and deliberate. It wasn't an animal scratching a tree. This was a display of power. I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my boots. I didn't wait anymore. I turned and ran for the porch, my boots slamming on the wooden steps. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking violently, desperately trying to fit the right one into the deadbolt. For a terrifying second, I thought I'd grabbed the wrong key. The thumping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a listening silence. I got the key in, turned it, and shoved the door open, stumbling inside. I slammed it shut behind me, my whole body weight thrown against it as if something was right on my heels. I threw the deadbolt, my fingers slipping on the metal, then slid the chain lock across. It was a flimsy piece of brass, but the sound of it clicking into place was the best thing I'd ever heard. I stood there for a full minute, maybe two, just leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. My heart was still pounding, a frantic drumbeat in my ears. I was sweating, a cold sweat that soaked through my t-shirt. I listened. Nothing. The absolute silence from outside was deafening. I moved to the front window, peering through the gap in the curtains. The porch light illuminated a small circle of my yard and the first few trees. Beyond that, nothing. Just a wall of black. I stood there, my forehead pressed against the cool glass, my gun still held tight in my hand, pointed at the floor. I waited for movement, for a shape to step out of the shadows, for another howl. Nothing. The woods had gone back to their normal, living silence. The crickets had even started up again. It didn't make sense. The rage in that second howl, the deliberate thumping, it didn't just stop. Animals don't do that. They don't make that much noise and then just vanish. I had to wake up my wife. She was sleeping upstairs. I crept up, my legs feeling like jelly. I didn't want to scare her, but I had to know. I shook her shoulder gently. She stirred, mumbling something. "Hey," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Hey, wake up for a second." She opened her eyes, squinting in the dim light from the hallway. "What? What's wrong? What time is it? Did you hear anything just now, like a few minutes ago?" She sat up a little, rubbing her eyes. "Hear what? No, I was asleep." "What did you hear?" "Animals," I said, not knowing how else to describe it. "Loud ones, really loud, like screaming. Did anyone around here get a new dog, a big one? Or, I don't know, has anyone mentioned anything about escaped animals, like from a zoo or something?" She looked at me like I was crazy. "A zoo? Honey, the nearest zoo is over 2 hours away. What are you talking about? It was probably just coyotes. You know how they get." This wasn't coyotes. I knew coyotes. This was something else. But I just nodded. "Yeah, probably. Sorry I woke you." She lay back down, already half asleep again. "It's fine. Come to bed." I went back downstairs. I couldn't go to bed. I was too wired, too full of this crawling electric fear. I sat in the dark living room, in my armchair that faces the big picture window, and I watched the woods. The gun was on the side table next to me. I sat there for hours until the sky started to lighten from black to deep blue. I didn't see a thing. I didn't hear a thing. The next day, in the clear light of a sunny June morning, it all felt like a bad dream. The woods looked peaceful, normal. I walked the tree line, my gun tucked in my waistband just in case. I looked for tracks, for broken branches, for anything. The ground was dry and hard. I didn't find anything conclusive. A few scuff marks that could have been anything. A few low branches that looked snapped. But that could have been from deer, from kids, from anything. But the sound was burned into my brain. That deep, guttural, angry howl. It wouldn't leave me alone. A few days later, I was online, just messing around, and I remembered the sounds. On a whim, I typed in "strange animal sounds in woods" into a search engine. It brought up a lot of junk, but then I found a forum for people who'd had unusual experiences. I started reading, and I found a thread with audio files, people posting recordings they'd taken. I clicked on one, my speakers turned down low. It was staticky, recorded on a cheap device, but the sound that came out made the blood drain from my face. It was the same low grunt, the same rising, almost human howl. The comments below it were filled with one word, over and over: Sasquatch, Bigfoot. I felt dizzy. I clicked another. This one was clearer, a recording from the Pacific Northwest. It was the howl, the exact same howl I'd heard, but this time it was followed by that same rhythmic, powerful tree thumping. Thump, thump, thump. My heart started doing that same frantic hammering it had done that night. My hands got cold. I spent the rest of the afternoon and late into the night listening to every recording I could find. The Sierra Sounds, the Ohio Howl, dozens of others. They were all variations of the same thing, that same basic vocalization I'd heard in my own backyard. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined it. Other people had heard it. A lot of other people. That was the moment the terror truly solidified. It wasn't the fleeting fear of that night anymore. It was a deep, permanent chill that settled into my bones. The unknown hadn't just been out there. It had heard me. It had answered me. It had been angry, and to this day, almost 2 decades later, I still don't go out to my truck after dark without a powerful flashlight in one hand and my gun in the other. I never mimic a sound I don't recognize, and I never ever forget that for one long, terrifying minute, the woods talked back. Story 8. The night was cool, the kind of cold that bites at your ears if you don't have a beanie on. The moon was just a sliver, a crooked little fingernail clipping in the sky, so it was dark, real dark. The kind of dark where your eyes play tricks on you after a while, turning stumps into animals and shadows into people. We'd set up a small camp about 100 yards from the water's edge, just a little fire ring we'd used forever, and some folding chairs. We'd been sitting around for a couple hours, talking in low voices, drinking coffee from a thermos, just enjoying the quiet. I guess I just needed to stretch my legs. That's what I told them. The coffee had gone through me, and sitting for so long was making me antsy. I told the guys I was going to walk down toward the old logging road, just a quick loop, maybe 10 minutes. Stephen joked that I'd better not get lost, and I told him to shut up. That was the last normal thing anyone said to me. I left the circle of firelight, and the feeling was immediate. It was like stepping through a curtain. 1 second I was in the warm, familiar world of my friends and the fire. The next, I was swallowed by the woods. The air got heavier, colder. My boots crunched on a carpet of dead leaves and pine needles, the sound ridiculously loud in the silence. I remember thinking how quiet it was, not a peaceful quiet, a dead quiet. No crickets, no owls, no rustle of squirrels, nothing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I had a headlamp, but I didn't turn it on. My eyes were adjusted to the dark, and the little bit of moonlight was enough to see the path. I figured I'd save the batteries. I walked for what felt like 5 minutes, following the familiar dip in the land that led toward the bayou. The trees were thick here, a mix of tall pines and gnarled oaks, their branches making a tangled roof overhead. That's when I first saw it. It was off to my left, maybe 50, 60 yards away, moving between the trees. At first, my brain did what it's supposed to do. It tried to file it away as something normal, a deer, a big buck, a bear. We have black bears around here. It's not impossible. But this was different. It was upright, walking on 2 legs, and it was huge. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing made me feel like a child. It moved with a strange, fluid grace that was wrong for its size. It wasn't lumbering or clumsy. It was smooth, almost gliding between the tree trunks, its form just a deeper shade of black against the dark of the forest. It was there for maybe 2, 3 seconds, just this massive silhouette cutting through the gaps in the trees. And then it was gone, behind a thick cluster of pines. My heart, which had been thumping along at a normal pace, just seized in my chest. It felt like a fist had closed around it. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. My mind was screaming at me, a jumble of words that didn't make sense. What was that? What the hell was that? I stood there for what felt like a full minute, just listening. The silence was absolute. I couldn't even hear the faint murmur of my friends back at camp anymore. It was just me and this oppressive, waiting quiet. My skin was crawling, a cold sweat breaking out on my back under my layers of clothing. Every hair on my arms and neck was standing straight up. This wasn't curiosity. This was a deep, primal fear, the kind that lives in your lizard brain and tells you you're prey. My first instinct was to run back to camp, just bolt, but my legs felt like they were made of wood. What if it was between me and the camp? What if I ran right into it? The thought of turning my back on that part of the woods made my stomach clench into a hard knot. Slowly, carefully, I fumbled in my pocket for my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. The light from the screen was blinding in the darkness. I didn't call. I texted Stephen. My thumbs were clumsy and thick. "Don't call. Come to me. Now, by the big fallen pine. Something's out here." I didn't know what else to say. "How do you text?" "I think I just saw Bigfoot. He'd have laughed his ass off. But Stephen knows me. He knows I don't spook easy. I've walked these woods my whole life. I've seen bobcats, heard coyotes, even had a bear bluff charge me once." This was a different category of feeling. I put the phone away and waited, my back against a wide oak tree. I tried to make myself as small as possible. I was straining my ears, trying to hear any sound over the frantic pounding of my own heart. I was scanning the woods where I'd seen it, but there was nothing, just stillness and shadow. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 3 or 4 minutes before I heard the careful, quiet crunch of footsteps approaching. I peeked around the tree and saw Stephen's shape coming down the path, moving cautiously. He had his rifle slung over his shoulder, and he was holding our night vision binoculars. When he got close, I could see the confusion and concern on his face in the dim light. "What's up, man?" he whispered, his voice tight. "You see a monster buck or something?" I just shook my head. I couldn't get the words out. I pointed a trembling finger toward the patch of pines. "Over there," I managed to rasp out. "It was walking on 2 legs. It was huge, Steve." He looked at me, and in the gloom I saw his expression change from confusion to a flicker of the same fear I was feeling. He didn't laugh. He just slowly unslung the binoculars from his neck. They were a good pair, military surplus, Gen 3. They turned the night into a weird greenish day. "Show me," he said, his voice low and serious. We moved together, side by side, creeping forward a few yards until we had a clearer line of sight to the pine grove. The trees were packed close together, a wall of darkness. Stephen raised the binoculars to his eyes. The faint electronic whine of them powering on was the only sound. He scanned slowly, left to right. I stood beside him, my body so tense it was starting to ache. I had my own rifle in my hands now, my finger resting alongside the trigger guard. I wasn't even thinking about shooting. It was just something to hold on to, something solid in a world that had suddenly become unbelievably soft and terrifying. "I don't see anything," Stephen whispered after a minute. "Just trees." "It was there," I insisted, my voice a desperate husk. I swear to God it was. He kept scanning. The seconds ticked by. My hope was starting to crumble, replaced by a creeping dread that maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the dark and the quiet had gotten to me. The thought was almost as scary as what I'd seen, because it felt so real. Then Stephen froze. His whole body went rigid. He didn't make a sound, but his posture screamed. He was locked onto something. "Dustin," he breathed. And the way he said my name, it was full of pure, undiluted fear. What is it?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. He slowly lowered the binoculars from his face and handed them to me. His hand was shaking. "Look," he said, "behind the big pine with the broken top. Don't make a sudden movement." My mouth was bone dry. I took the binoculars, my own hands trembling so violently I had to clamp them against my chest to steady them. I raised them to my eyes. The world bloomed into that eerie, luminous green. I could see every detail of the forest floor, every leaf, every twig. I panned over. My breath held until I found the pine tree he'd mentioned. It was a giant with a jagged top where lightning had struck it years ago, and then I saw it. At first, it was just 2 points of light, 2 perfect, brilliant circles of white shine, like tiny, malevolent moons. They were about 7, maybe 8 feet off the ground. They were unmoving, just staring. My brain tried to process it. An animal's eyes. A deer's eyes are green or yellow in night vision. A raccoon's are red. These were a piercing, reflective white, and they were too far apart. The space between them was wrong. It suggested a head that was much broader than any animal I knew. I adjusted my grip on the binoculars, my knuckles white. I focused past the eye shine, trying to make out the shape behind it. And I did. It was peering out from behind the trunk of the pine tree. Not all the way, just the side of its head and one massive shoulder. The face was dark, but in the enhanced light of the binoculars, I could see the texture of it. It wasn't fur like a bear. It was more like hair. Thick, matted, dark hair. And the shape of the head was conical, almost pointed at the top. I couldn't make out a nose or a mouth, just the dark shadow of a face and those two terrifyingly bright white eyes locked right on us. It knew we were there. It was watching us watch it. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. My legs went weak. This wasn't a deer. This wasn't a bear. This was something else. Something that stood on two legs. Something that hid and watched with an intelligence that felt ancient and cold. The sheer size of it, the way it was positioned, it was hiding. It was being cautious. Animals don't do that. Animals run or attack. They don't play peekaboo from behind a tree. The adrenaline hit me then, a massive, shocking jolt that flooded my system. It was a physical sensation, like being doused in ice water. My hearing sharpened, my vision tunneled. Every sense was screaming danger. I could feel the rough texture of the binoculars' housing, smell the damp earth and pine, taste the coppery fear in my mouth. It's looking right at us, I whispered to Stephen, my voice cracking. I know, he said back, his own voice thin and strained. What do we do? We stood there for what felt like an hour, just staring at those two unmoving white eyes. It was a standoff. We were too scared to move, and it was just waiting. The silence was a physical weight pressing down on us. I could feel the sweat trickling down my temple, cold in the night air. Finally, a crazy, reckless thought entered my head. We had to know. We couldn't just stand here until dawn. We had to get closer. We had to see. We're going to advance, I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. Slowly, together. Stephen just nodded, his face a mask of green terror in the faint light, reflecting off the binoculars I was still holding. I lowered them. The world snapped back to near total darkness. The white eyes were gone, of course, invisible to the naked eye, but I knew they were still there, watching. We started walking. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every step was a conscious effort, a fight against every instinct that was telling me to run. Our footsteps were deafening. We moved in a slow, clumsy shuffle, side by side, our rifles held ready but feeling utterly useless. We were maybe 40 yards away, then 30. The pine tree loomed larger in front of us. I could see the details of its bark now, the way its branches reached out like skeletal arms. My eyes were fixed on the spot where the thing had been. I was waiting for it to step out. I was waiting for it to charge. My muscles were coiled so tight they were burning. 20 yards. I could see the space behind the tree now. The gap was empty. My heart sank and soared at the same time. Maybe it had run. Maybe it was gone. 15 yards. We were close enough to see the individual needles on the lower branches. Stephen and I exchanged a glance. His eyes were wide, his nostrils flared. He was as terrified as I was. We took the last few steps together, rounding the trunk of the big pine, our rifles coming up almost of their own accord. There was nothing there, just the forest floor, a few ferns and more trees. It was gone. The space behind the tree was empty, completely, utterly empty. There was no sound of something crashing away through the underbrush. No snapped branches, no disturbed leaves. It had just vanished. The sudden absence was almost more terrifying than its presence had been. The pressure of being watched was gone, leaving a hollow, ringing silence in its place. The adrenaline that had been coursing through me evaporated, and I was left feeling weak and dizzy, my body trembling uncontrollably. Stephen let out a shaky breath, lowering his rifle. "Where did it go?" he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. I just shook my head. I couldn't speak. I walked forward a few more steps, my eyes scanning the ground. Nothing, not a single track. The ground was soft there, a bed of moss and decaying leaves. Something that big, that heavy, should have left a print, a deep, obvious print. There was nothing. It was as if it had never been there at all. We stood there for a long time, just staring at the empty space, listening to the nothing. The normal night sounds started to trickle back in. A distant owl, the rustle of a light breeze in the treetops. The world was returning to normal, but we weren't. We were changed. We walked back to camp in a daze, not saying a word. Mark and Jake asked what was wrong, but we just shook our heads. We packed up our gear in record time, the fire still smouldering, and got the hell out of there. That was last October. I haven't been back to the north end of Mercer Bayou since. Stephen won't talk about it. When I bring it up, he just gets quiet and changes the subject. I lie awake sometimes at night, and all I can see are those two perfect, shining white eyes in the green glow of the binoculars, staring out from behind that tree with a calm, knowing intelligence. I felt its gaze. I felt how big it was. I know what I saw, and I have no explanation for where it went. None at all. It was just there, watching us, and then it was gone. Chapter Story 9. It was one of those dead winter days where the sky looks like dirty dishwater, and the cold just settles right into your bones. Me and my friend, we were both 15, stuck in that weird space between Christmas break being over and nothing to do until school started back up. Bored out of our minds. Her dad had an old .22 rifle he let us use for target practice sometimes, and we got it in our heads to go walk the frozen creeks out near Wildcat Road. It was something to do, you know? Get out of the house, make some noise, feel a little adventurous. We'd been out there for a couple hours. The air was so still and quiet. The kind of quiet where your own breathing sounds loud. The only noise was the crunch-crunch of our boots on the frozen ground and the occasional crackle of the ice underfoot when we stepped onto the creek. We weren't really shooting at anything, just taking turns plinking at icicles hanging from the rock overhangs and old beer cans we'd found washed up on the bank. The .22 sounded like a loud pop, a sharp noise that would echo for a second and then get swallowed up by all the trees. It felt safe. It felt like our backyard, even though we were a good ways from any houses. We'd wandered further than we meant to, following a twist in the creek that took us into a holler we didn't recognize. The land started to rise up on both sides, steep hills covered in bare trees and thickets of briars. We came to a spot where a fallen tree blocked the creek, and the only way to keep going forward was to climb up the bank and cross this old rusty barbed wire fence that was sagging between wooden posts. I went first. I handed the rifle to my friend and started climbing over. It was one of those awkward maneuvers where you have to kind of lift one leg high, get your foot on the middle wire, and hoist yourself over, trying not to snag your jeans on the barbs. I was halfway over, one leg on the other side, my hands gripping a cold, splintery fence post, when I heard it. It wasn't a branch breaking. It wasn't a deer. It was a heavy, solid thump, like if someone took a big sack of wet sand and dropped it on the ground from a few feet up. The sound came from the hillside to our right, a steep slope covered in brown leaves and shadowy trees. I froze, still straddling the fence. My friend, who was standing there holding the rifle, froze too. Our eyes met for a second, a silent question. Then we both looked up the hill. That's when we saw it. About halfway up the slope, maybe 50 yards away, there was this thing. It was huge. I mean, just massive. It was standing on two legs, bent over slightly like it was digging at something in the ground with its hands. It was covered in this long, shaggy hair, the color of wet, dark earth, almost black. It was so much bigger than a man. The proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were impossibly wide, and its arms were long, hanging down past its knees. My brain just short-circuited. It couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like looking at a bear, but a bear that was standing straight up and was built all wrong. For a second, we just stood there, paralyzed. I think part of my mind was still trying to find a logical explanation, a weird shadow, a stump, anything. Then it stopped what it was doing. It straightened up, it turned its head, and it looked right at us. That was the moment. That was the moment the whole world just dropped out from under me. It wasn't just seeing it. It was it seeing us. Its face. It wasn't a bear's face. It was flatter in the eyes. I will never ever forget those eyes. They were dark, but they weren't animal eyes. There was an intelligence there, a cold, focused awareness. It wasn't a startled look, like a deer gets. It was a direct, penetrating stare. It was looking right into me, and I felt this primal, icy terror shoot down my spine and lock up my whole body. It knew we were there. It knew exactly what we were. Time didn't just stop, it shattered. My friend made this little gasping sound, a choked-off squeak. The rifle, which she'd been holding loosely, clattered to the frozen ground. The sound of it hitting the dirt seemed to break the spell. We ran. I don't even remember getting down from that fence. 1 second I was straddling it. The next I was on the ground, my legs already churning. There was no thought, no plan. There was only the pure, blind animal need to get away. We didn't scream. We didn't say a word to each other. We just ran, crashing back the way we came, along the creek bank. For the first few seconds, there was nothing but the sound of our own frantic breathing and the thunder of our feet. Then, from behind us, came the sound. It was a crash, a violent, powerful crashing through the woods. It wasn't running on the path. It was coming straight down the hillside, through the trees and the undergrowth. And it was fast, so much faster than us. You could hear the sheer power of it, the snap of branches, the crunch of deadfall being trampled under a weight I couldn't even comprehend. It wasn't just following us. It was charging. It was gaining ground with every second. I've never been so terrified in my life. It's a different kind of fear than being scared of a test or getting in trouble. This was a deep, cellular fear, the kind that makes your bladder feel weak and your vision tunnel. I could feel the vibrations of its footsteps through the ground. I could hear it getting closer, the crashing sound growing from a rumble to a roar. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I looked back, I would trip, or I would see it, and if I saw it, I would just freeze up, and that would be the end. My lungs were burning. The cold air felt like shards of glass in my throat. My legs were screaming, heavy as lead. My friend was just ahead of me, her ponytail whipping back and forth. I could hear her sobbing with each breath, this ragged, terrified sound. We were running for our lives, and we both knew it. This wasn't a game. This was it. The thought of the rifle flashed through my mind. It was lying back there by the fence, useless. Even if we had it, what would a .22 do against something that big? The idea was a sick joke. The crashing was right behind us now. I could hear its breathing, a deep, guttural huffing sound, like a locomotive. I could smell it too, a wave of musky, foul odor, like a wet dog that had been rolling in something dead. Washed over us. It was so close. I braced for impact. I expected to feel a hand, a claw, something grab me from behind and just tear me away. And then, just like that, the crashing stopped. We didn't stop running. We kept going. Our bodies operating on pure autopilot, but the sound of its pursuit was gone. The woods behind us went silent, except for the ringing in our own ears and our desperate, wheezing gasps for air. We burst out of the tree line into a clearing, a wide, flat field covered in brown, frozen grass. The sudden sunlight was blinding. We staggered a few more feet into the field and then collapsed, falling to our hands and knees. I was vomiting, my whole body convulsing, the acid taste of fear and exhaustion burning my throat. My friend was just curled up on the ground, crying, great, heaving sobs. We lay there for what felt like an hour, just trying to breathe, to make our hearts stop trying to hammer their way out of our chests. The silence was absolute. The woods we had just fled from were dark and still. Nothing came out, nothing moved. Slowly, Shakily, we pushed ourselves up. We didn't speak. We just looked at each other, our faces pale, our eyes wide, with a shared horror that I knew, right then, would be a part of us forever. We started walking, then jogging, then running again, not because we were being chased, but because we couldn't stand to be near those woods for one more second. We didn't stop until we saw the first house, a familiar one at the edge of Wildcat Road. We ran up onto the porch and banged on the door. An old man we knew opened it, and he took one look at our faces, at the sheer, undiluted terror, and just ushered us inside without a word. We tried to tell him what happened, but the words came out in a jumbled, hysterical mess. A thing. In the woods. It chased us. He gave us water and let us sit by his heater until we stopped shaking. I don't think he really believed us, but he saw that we believed it. And that was enough for him to be kind. We never went back for the rifle. Her dad was mad about it for a week, but we never told him the real reason we lost it. We just said we'd set it down and forgotten where. What were we supposed to say? That was years ago. I'm an adult now. I have a job, a life. But sometimes, at night, if the wind is blowing just right through the trees outside my window, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, that heavy thump sound echoing in my ears. I'll remember the way it straightened up. I'll remember it turning its head, and I'll remember with a clarity that never fades, the absolute, terrifying intelligence in its eyes when it stared right at me. It wasn't just some animal. It saw me. It knew I was there, and for a few seconds, as it crashed through the woods behind us, it wanted to catch me. Then, for some reason, I will never, ever understand, it just stopped. Story 10. Okay, so I've never posted anything like this before, but I need to get this out there, because it's been eating at me for weeks now. I'm still kind of shaky just thinking about it, and my fiancé doesn't even like to talk about it anymore, which I get, but I have to tell someone who might understand, because what happened that evening on Route 36 in Ohio wasn't normal at all. It was a Tuesday, I think, around 6:30 in the evening. We were driving eastbound on Route 36, heading back from visiting my parents in Urbana. My fiancé was in the passenger seat, and we were just chatting about random stuff, what to have for dinner, maybe stopping for groceries, that kind of thing. The sun was starting to dip low, casting long shadows across the road, but it wasn't fully dark yet. You know that time of day where everything looks kind of golden and peaceful? That's how it was. The road itself is pretty rural out there, lots of fields, some patches of woods, and every now and then a farmhouse set way back from the highway. Traffic was light, just us and a couple of other cars spread out. I was driving maybe 5 miles over the speed limit. Nothing crazy, just cruising along. My car is an older Honda Civic, so it's not exactly a luxury ride, but it gets the job done. The radio was on low, playing some classic rock station, and I remember feeling relaxed, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the center console. My fiancée was scrolling through her phone, occasionally looking up to point out something in the scenery. It was all so ordinary, which is why what happened next hit me like a punch to the gut. Out of nowhere, this figure, darted across the road from north to south. I mean, it moved so fast that my brain barely had time to register it. 1 second, the road was clear ahead of us, maybe 100 yards or so, and the next, this shadowy shape was just there, sprinting right in front of the car. And when I say sprinting, I don't mean like a person jogging or even running fast. This was something else entirely. It covered what had to be 30 yards in 3 steps. 3 steps. I counted them in my head because it was so unreal that my mind just latched onto that detail. Step, 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 and it was gone. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it felt like time slowed down. The figure was tall, really tall, I'd guess over 7 feet, but it was hard to tell because it was moving so quick. It was on 2 legs, like a person, but the proportions were off. Lean and muscular, with long arms that swung as it ran, but it was all shadows and motion. It didn't look furry or hairy, not that I could see, It was more like a dark, human-like shape, but not quite human. The speed was what got me. It was faster than any Olympic sprinter I've ever seen on TV, blinding fast, and it didn't make a sound. No thud, no rustle, nothing. Just this silent, fluid movement. I slammed on the brakes instinctively, but we didn't come to a full stop. The car jerked forward, and my fiancée gasped, dropping her phone. "What the hell was that?" she said, her voice tight with panic. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, like it was trying to break out of my ribs. My hands were gripping the wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road behind us, the ditch on the south side, where it had disappeared. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice coming out all shaky. She nodded, her eyes wide, and she was breathing fast, like she'd just run a mile. "Yeah, I saw it," she whispered. "What was it?" We both stared ahead, but the road was clear again. No sign of anything. The whole thing felt like a hallucination, but we both saw it. There was no doubt about that. I eased off the brake and kept driving, but slower now, maybe 20 miles an hour. My foot was trembling on the gas pedal. I kept glancing over at the south side of the road, where it had vanished into this deep ditch. The ditch was overgrown with weeds and tall grass, and beyond it, there was a steep embankment that led up to a wooded area. In that moment, all I could think was that whatever it was, it had to have jumped to get across that ditch and up the embankment, because there was no way it just ran through it. The ditch was at least 6 feet deep, with a sharp drop-off from the road. We didn't talk much for the next few minutes. The mood in the car had shifted completely. The easygoing vibe was gone, replaced by this thick, heavy tension. I could feel the hair on my arms standing up, and a cold sweat had broken out on my forehead. My fiancée kept looking back, like she expected to see it following us. But there was nothing. The sun was almost down now, and the shadows were getting longer, making everything feel eerie and wrong. After a while, she said, "Do you think it was a person?" But her voice was doubtful. I shook my head. No way. No person moves that fast. And it was too tall. We threw out a few ideas. Maybe a deer, but deer don't run on 2 legs, and they're not that shape. A bear, but bears aren't that upright, and they're not that quick in short bursts like that. Plus, Ohio doesn't have bears in that area, not that I know of. The more we talked, the more it didn't make sense. My mind kept going back to stories I'd heard online, or from friends about weird sightings in rural Ohio, but I never paid much attention to them before. Now, though, it felt different. I remember the physical sensation so clearly. My stomach was in knots, and I had this urge to just get home as fast as possible, but I was also scared to speed up. Every little movement in the peripheral vision made me jump. A bird flying out of a tree, a leaf blowing across the road. My heart would skip a beat. My fiancée was the same. She kept her arms crossed tight over her chest, like she was trying to hold herself together. The radio was still on, but I turned it off because the noise felt distracting, almost invasive. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine and our breathing. We drove the rest of the way home in near silence, maybe another 20 minutes. When we pulled into our driveway, I sat there for a minute with the engine running, just staring ahead. My hands were still trembling. My fiancée got out without saying anything and went inside, and I followed after turning off the car. The whole evening we were both on edge. We didn't even eat much for dinner, just picked at our food. We tried to watch TV, but I couldn't focus. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that figure darting across the road, its speed, its shape. It was burned into my brain. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to go back and see the spot. My fiancée didn't want to come. She said it gave her the creeps, so I went alone. It was around the same time, late afternoon, but the sunlight felt different, harsher, less peaceful. I drove slowly along Route 36 eastbound until I found the approximate area where it happened. I pulled over on the shoulder, got out, and walked over to the south side of the road. The ditch was exactly as I remembered, deep and overgrown. But seeing it in daylight, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The ditch wasn't just a gentle slope, it was a sharp drop, about 6 or 7 feet down, and then there was an embankment that rose another 4 or 5 feet up to the tree line. The distance from the road to the top of the embankment had to be at least 10 feet horizontally, and the figure had covered it in what seemed like one leap after those 3 steps on the road. I stood there, staring at it, and tried to imagine a person or anything making that jump. It was impossible. No human could do it without a running start, and even then it would be a stretch. But this thing had done it in a split second, without breaking stride. I walked along the edge of the ditch, looking for footprints or any sign, but the ground was dry and hard, covered in grass and weeds. Nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed earth, nothing. It was like it had never been there. But I knew what I saw. The realization hit me then. Whatever it wasn't just fast. It was powerful in a way that didn't seem natural. The terror from the night before came rushing back, and I felt that same cold sweat on my neck. I got back in my car and drove away quickly, not wanting to stay there any longer. Since then, I've gone over it in my head 1,000 times. My fiancée and I have talked about it a bit, but she doesn't like to dwell on it. We've come up with theories. Maybe it was some kind of animal we've never seen or something else. But nothing fits. I've looked up stories online, and there are accounts of similar things in Ohio, people seeing tall, fast-moving figures in the woods, but reading them just makes me more uneasy. It's the not knowing that gets to me. The fact that something like that could be out there, and we have no idea what it is. That day on Route 36 changed how I see things. I used to love driving through rural areas at dusk, but now I get nervous. Every shadow feels like it could move, and every noise puts me on edge. The worst part is that it all happened so fast, and we didn't stop, so there's no proof, no closure, just this lingering fear that whatever it was, it's still out there, and maybe it saw us too. I don't have any answers, and I probably never will. All I know is what I saw, and it's something I'll never forget. Story 11. Okay, I'll try to write this the way it needs to be. I'm still not really over it, and my hands are a little shaky even now just thinking about it, but I need to get this out. Maybe writing it down will help, or maybe it'll just make me remember it all over again. I don't know. So for years, my family's had this cabin right on the edge of a national forest in Pennsylvania. I've been going up there since I was a kid, first with my dad and uncles, then later with my own friends. It's this old A-frame place, kind of rustic, no running water, just a pump-out back and an outhouse a little ways into the trees. We'd go up there to hunt, fish, just get away from everything. It was always peaceful, you know. The kind of quiet that actually feels quiet, not just the absence of noise, but something deeper. But that started to change about 7 years ago. Little things at first. That feeling you get when you know someone's watching you, even though you're miles from anyone. You shrug it off, tell yourself it's just a deer or a squirrel. Then the sounds started, not the normal night sounds. The owls, the coyotes way off in the distance. These were different. Loud knocks, like someone was hitting a tree with a big branch, but there was never anyone there. The sound of branches snapping, not the little crack of a deer stepping on a twig, but the sound of something big, something heavy, just breaking a branch in half, and footsteps, bipedal footsteps. You can tell, you know? The rhythm is different from a bear or a deer. 2 legs, left, right, left, right. But these were so much heavier than a person's. They had a weight to them that made the ground feel solid under your own feet, like a bass drum you could feel in your chest. And the smells, oh God, the smells. It's hard to describe. It was like a skunk had died and then been left in a porta potty for a week. This thick, putrid odor that would just roll through the woods and hang in the air, so strong it made your eyes water and your stomach turn. It would come and go, no rhyme or reason to it. We had a bunch of weird nights, but one that really sticks out was a couple of years back. It was the middle of the night, must have been around 2 in the morning. I was asleep in the top bunk, and I was woken up by this scraping, dragging sound from the deck. We have these heavy Adirondack chairs and a little metal table out there. It sounded like someone was moving them around. My first thought, half asleep, was bear. They get into stuff sometimes, knock over the grill, that kind of thing. I lay there for a minute, listening. It wasn't a frantic sound. It was deliberate, a slow, heavy scrape, then a thud, like something was rearranging the furniture. I didn't get up. I just lay there, my heart hammering against my ribs, listening to this thing move around on my deck. Eventually it stopped. The woods went quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than the noise. In the morning, we went out to look. The chairs were all pushed back against the cabin wall, not where we'd left them, and the fire pit. We'd let the fire die down before bed. Just a pile of smoldering logs and ash. Something had reached in and scattered the logs, rolling them out of the pit. A couple were still smoking, lying 10 feet away on the pine needles. No bear tracks, nothing. Just this mess, like something had been looking for something in the ashes. We tried to explain it away. A really smart bear, we said. A weird bear, but it didn't sit right. It never did. The incident I want to talk about, the one that really sealed it for me, happened just this past fall. It was early November. The air was crisp, the kind that bites at your ears, and all the leaves were down, so you could see farther into the woods. But that also meant everything was just gray and brown and brittle. My buddy was up there with me. We'd been out since before dawn, trying to get a deer, but we hadn't seen anything, not a squirrel, not a bird. The woods were dead silent, which was the first weird thing. At that time of year, there should be some activity. We were walking along this old logging road, not really talking, just listening. That's when the smell hit us. It wasn't just the usual skunk and sewage smell. This was worse. It was so thick and foul, it was like walking into a wall. I actually gagged, and my buddy stopped and put his hand over his nose and mouth. His eyes were wide. We both knew this smell. It was the one that always came before something bad happened, and then came the feeling, that feeling of being watched. It's not a vague paranoia, it's a physical sensation. The hair on your arms and the back of your neck stands up. Your skin gets tight and crawly, like 1,000 tiny bugs are marching across it. You feel exposed, completely and utterly visible, like you're standing under a spotlight in the middle of the woods. We both felt it at the same time. We just looked at each other, and without a word, we brought our rifles up, not aiming at anything, just holding them ready. Our breath was making little clouds in the cold air, and I remember thinking how loud my own breathing sounded. We stood there for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only a minute or two, just scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The silence was absolute. And then we heard the howl. It wasn't a coyote. I've heard coyotes my whole life. It wasn't a wolf. There aren't any around here. This was different. It started low, this deep, guttural growl of a sound that seemed to vibrate up from the ground, and then it rose in pitch, not smoothly, but in these weird, broken stages, like it was hitting notes that didn't belong together. It was loud, too, way louder than any animal I've ever heard. It didn't sound like it was calling to its pack. It sounded, I don't know. It sounded like it was announcing itself, and it was close, too close. The howl cut off as abruptly as it started. The silence that followed was even worse. My buddy looked at me, his face pale. He just mouthed one word: go. We didn't run. You don't run in the woods when you don't know what you're running from. But we moved fast, walking backwards for a few steps, then turning and hustling back down the logging road towards the cabin, our heads on a swivel, looking behind us, to the sides, everywhere. I've never felt so much like prey in my life. Every shadow between the trees looked like it was moving. Every little sound, the crunch of our own boots on the frozen ground, sounded like a signal. We made it back to the cabin and got inside. Bolting the door like that would do any good. We didn't talk about it much. What was there to say? We both knew we'd heard something that wasn't supposed to be in those woods. That was bad, but the thing that happened to me alone a few years before that, in March of 2014, that was maybe more terrifying because it was so personal. It was a clear, cold night, the kind where the sky is so black and the stars are so bright, you feel like you could reach up and touch them. I'd gotten into the habit of taking a blanket and lying out in this little meadow about 100 yards from the cabin to just look at the stars. It was my little piece of quiet. This one night I was out there, just lying on my back, looking at Orion. The ground was still partly frozen, and I could feel the cold seeping through the blanket. It was perfectly quiet, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Bipedal footsteps. Left, right, heavy, deliberate. They were coming from the slope on the other side of the meadow, from where the tree line was thick and dark. They weren't rushing, they were just walking, coming down the slope towards me. My heart just froze in my chest. I sat up, pulling my knees to my chest, staring into the blackness of the trees. I couldn't see anything. It was too dark, but I could hear it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Each step was slow and measured, like whatever it was knew exactly where it was going. It was getting closer. I couldn't just lie there. My voice came out as a croak. Hello? The footsteps stopped. Just like that. The silence was instant and total. I held my breath, listening so hard my ears started to ring. Nothing. Maybe a minute went by, maybe two. The cold was really sinking into me now, making me shiver. Maybe it was just my imagination, I thought. A trick of the wind. Then the footsteps started again. Crunch, crunch. Closer now. Much closer. It was at the edge of the meadow, just inside the tree line. I could feel the panic starting to rise in my throat, cold and metallic. "Who's there?" I yelled, and my voice sounded thin and scared in the huge, dark space. The footsteps stopped again. This time the silence was worse. It was a waiting silence. I could feel it waiting. I could feel its attention on me, like a physical pressure. I wasn't just being watched. I was being studied. And then I heard a different sound, not footsteps, a soft, rustling sound in the bushes right at the edge of the meadow, maybe 30, 40 feet from me. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of something big moving through the undergrowth, slowly, carefully. I could picture it standing there just inside the curtain of shadows, looking out at me lying there in the open. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I scrambled to my feet, my legs feeling like jelly, grabbing my blanket. I didn't run, not at first. I backed away, keeping my eyes on that spot in the bushes where I'd heard the movement. I walked backwards across the meadow, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I didn't turn my back on those trees until I was at the edge of the clearing. And then I broke into a run, not caring about the noise, just wanting to get to the cabin, to a door, to a wall between me and whatever was out there. I slammed the cabin door shut and leaned against it, breathing like I'd just run a marathon. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat in a chair by the window, staring out into the dark, waiting for something to appear. It never did. All these things built up over the years, the knocks, the footsteps, the smells, the feeling of being watched, the howls, the night in the meadow. We never saw anything, not a shape, not a silhouette, nothing. And in a way, that was the worst part. Your mind tries to fill in the blank, and it always comes up with something worse than reality probably is. But the most recent thing, the one that happened just a few weeks ago, that was the final piece. It was the thing that made me believe, without a single doubt, that whatever this is, it's not just an animal. It's intelligent. It's aware of us. We were up at the cabin again, a group of 4 of us. It was getting towards evening. and we were all a little on edge because we'd been hearing the knocks on and off all afternoon. They'd come from one ridge, then 10 minutes later, from another direction entirely, like it was moving around us in a wide circle. My one friend, he's a bit of a joker, he got this idea. He said, maybe it's just lonely. Maybe it wants to talk. He was trying to lighten the mood, but it fell flat. We were all too tense. He went out on the deck, cupped his hands around his mouth, and let out this long, loud howl. It wasn't a mockery, really. It was just a human trying to sound like an animal. It echoed through the valley for a second, and then died out. The silence that followed was the heaviest, most profound silence I have ever experienced. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. We all stood there on the deck, frozen, waiting. And then it answered. It wasn't a howl. It was a sound I'd never heard before and hope I never hear again. It was lower than the howls, a deep, guttural, almost grinding roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was so loud, it felt like it was inside my skull, vibrating my teeth. It wasn't a call. It was a challenge. It was a statement. It was pure, raw power. And in the exact same instant that the sound ripped through the woods, from the dense patch of pines maybe 200 yards up the slope from the cabin, there was another sound, a loud, sharp, sickening crack. It wasn't a branch breaking. It was the sound of a tree trunk snapping. We all heard it, a thick, solid crack like a rifle shot, followed by the groaning, crashing sound of a whole tree coming down. We could hear it smashing through other branches on its way to the ground. The impact shook the deck under our feet. The roar stopped. The woods went dead silent again. We just stood there, staring at each other, our faces white with sheer terror. My joker friend looked like he was going to be sick. There was no doubt in any of our minds. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a response. Something heard his stupid human howl, and it roared back with a force that could break a tree, just to show us what it could do, to show us how small and weak we really were. We didn't say a word. We went back inside, locked the door, and we didn't sleep. We just sat there in the main room listening until the sun came up. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I don't think I ever can. Whatever is out there in those mountains, it's not a bear, it's not a lost hiker, it's not anything I can explain. It's intelligent, it's powerful, and it knows we're there. And that feeling, that deep, cold sense of dread and curiosity, it hasn't left me. It's with me all the time now, like a shadow I can't shake. I just don't know what it is, and I don't think I ever want to find out. Story 12. I was driving down US 27 near Homestead, Florida, back in the early 1970s. It was one of those late evenings where the sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving this weird orange and purple haze in the sky that made everything feel kind of eerie. I'd been visiting an old buddy who lived up in Florida City, and I was heading home to my place farther south. The road was pretty empty, just me and a few other cars here and there, and I had the windows rolled down because the air was warm and humid, the kind that sticks to your skin. I remember the radio was playing some classic rock station, but I wasn't really paying attention. My mind was wandering, thinking about work the next day and whether I should stop for a bite to eat. Then I saw the red flashing lights up ahead. At first I thought it was just a routine traffic stop or something, but as I got closer, I could tell it was more than that. There was this sense of chaos, like the lights were blinking crazy fast, and I could see a car pulled over to the side, its front all smashed in. I slowed down without even thinking, curiosity, I guess, or maybe some dumb instinct to rubberneck. I pulled over onto the shoulder a little ways back, not too close, but close enough to see what was going on. The second I stopped, this weird feeling hit me. It was like someone was watching me from the trees lining the road. I've never been one to get spooked easily. I grew up around here, spent plenty of nights camping and fishing, but this was different. It was this heavy, crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like cold fingers brushing against my skin. I shook my head, told myself it was just the stress of seeing an accident, but it didn't go away. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see eyes staring back from the darkness, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I got out of the car slowly, leaving the door open in case I needed to jump back in quick. The air smelled like gasoline and wet earth, with that distinct Florida swampiness hanging in the background. Up ahead, I could see the wrecked car, a beat-up sedan, maybe a Ford or something, with the front quarter panel completely crushed. It looked like it had hit a tree or a big animal, but there wasn't any tree around. Just this open stretch of road with dense woods on either side. The red and blue lights from the police cars cast long, shifting shadows, making everything feel unreal. There were 2 officers on scene, one from the Florida Highway Patrol in his tan uniform, and another from the Dade County Sheriff's Office in darker blues. They were standing near the wreck, talking in low voices, and I could see their breath misting in the cool evening air. Then, from the edge of the woods, they emerged with this guy between them. He was a mess. Clothes torn, face pale and sweaty, and he was shaking so bad he could barely walk. The officers had to kind of support him, one on each arm, and he kept looking back over his shoulder into the trees like he was expecting something to chase him. I edged a bit closer, trying to hear what was being said without drawing attention to myself. My heart was thumping in my chest, and that feeling of being watched got stronger, like whatever was out there was focusing on me now. The man's voice was shaky, almost a whisper, but I caught bits of it. He was saying he'd hit something, not a deer, not a person, but something big and fast. It came out of nowhere, he kept repeating, and he gestured toward the woods. It ran off, I saw it go. The trooper, a tall guy with a stern face, shook his head. "Sir, no one could have survived that impact and just run away. Look at your car." He pointed to the crushed front, and I could see where the metal was bent inward, like something massive had slammed into it. The deputy, a younger guy with a nervous twitch, added, "I've been on this road for years, and I've never seen a bear move like that. Bears don't just vanish into thick brush without a trace." That sent a chill down my spine. A bear. But the way they said it, it wasn't convincing. It was like they were trying to rationalize something they didn't understand. The man insisted, his voice rising with panic. It wasn't a bear. It was tall, covered in hair, and it moved on 2 legs. I swear it. He was almost crying now, and the officers exchanged this look, like they'd heard this kind of thing before but didn't want to believe it. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. That sensation of being watched was overwhelming now, like eyes were boring into me from the darkness. I found myself scanning the tree line, my eyes straining to see past the first layer of bushes and palms. The woods were thick and shadowy, with vines hanging down, and the ground all muddy from recent rains. Every little sound, a twig snapping, the rustle of leaves made me jump. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, and my hands were clammy. Part of me wanted to get back in my car and drive away, but I was frozen, caught in this morbid curiosity. The officers led the man toward one of the patrol cars, probably to take a statement or get him checked out. As they passed by, I caught the trooper's eye for a second, and he gave me this curt nod, like, "Move along, nothing to see here." But there was something in his expression, a flicker of unease, maybe even fear. It wasn't the calm, professional demeanor I'd expect from law enforcement. It was like they were spooked too. I decided I'd seen enough. My legs felt weak as I walked back to my car, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see some shape moving in the trees. The whole time, that feeling of being watched never let up. It was like a weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I slid into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I rolled up the windows, suddenly feeling exposed with them down. The humid air inside the car felt stifling, but I needed the barrier. As I pulled back onto the road, driving slowly past the accident scene, I could see the officers shining flashlights into the woods, their beams cutting through the darkness. They were calling out, but I couldn't hear what they were saying over the sound of my engine and the radio, which I'd left on low. My mind was racing. What had that man hit? Why were the officers so confused? And why did I feel like something was out there, watching us all? I drove for a few miles, the red lights fading in my rear-view mirror, but the unease didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. The road was dark now, with only my headlights cutting a path through the night. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see something following me, but it was just empty road. My heart was still pounding, and I had this tightness in my stomach, like I'd just run a marathon. To calm my nerves, I turned up the radio. It was still on that rock station, but then it cut to a news break. The announcer's voice was calm, almost too casual. But what he said made my blood run cold. He mentioned a report from earlier that evening on US 27, where a driver had claimed to hit the Florida skunk ape. This local legend thing I'd heard whispers about, but never paid much mind to. According to the report, law enforcement had pursued the creature into a thicket, but lost track of it. The announcer wrapped it up with a dismissive comment, like it was just another crazy story. But I felt a jolt of recognition. It all clicked into place. The man's shaken state, the officer's disbelief, that remark about the bear not moving like that, and my own feeling of being watched. I hadn't just witnessed an accident. I'd been close to something unexplainable. The skunk ape, or whatever it was, might have been right there in those woods, watching us as we stood around confused and scared. The thought made my skin crawl. I could almost smell it. A musky animal scent that I hadn't noticed before, but now it seemed to linger in the air. I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every shadow on the road made me flinch, and I kept the radio off, not wanting to hear anymore. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long time, just staring at the dark windows of my house. That heavy feeling was still with me, a deep-seated dread that I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about the woods, the way the man had looked back, and how the officers had seemed so out of their depth. I never told anyone about it for years, not until I moved away and started hearing similar accounts from hunters and other folks in the area. But that night, as I got out of the car and hurried inside, locking the door behind me, I knew something had changed. I'd felt a presence out there, something ancient and wild, and it had left its mark on me. To this day, I can't explain what really happened, but the memory of those red flashing lights and the unseen eyes in the darkness haunts me like a ghost that never fades. Story 13. That morning started like any other. I woke up before sunrise, the air still cool and damp. I live alone in a small cabin on the edge of town, and I've always been a man who likes his solitude. I'm used to the woods and the swamps. I've hunted and trapped out there since I was a boy, so I know the land pretty well. But that day, I was heading into the swamps to check some traps I'd set for muskrats, and maybe see if I could bag a deer, if I got lucky. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just another day in the wild. I packed my gear, my old rifle, a knife, some jerky and hardtack for lunch, and a canteen of water. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, casting a pale orange light through the trees. I remember the smell of wet earth and decay that always hangs over the swamps. It's thick and heavy, like breathing in mud. The ground was soft under my boots, squelching with every step. I've always been careful in there because the swamp can be treacherous, sinkholes, snakes, all sorts of things. But I've never been scared of it. Not until that day. I made my way southwest, following a game trail I've used for years. The trees were dense, mostly cypress and tupelo, their roots twisting out of the water like bony fingers. Spanish moss draped from the branches, swaying gently in the breeze. It was quiet at first, the way it often is in the early morning. just the occasional bird call or the splash of a fish. I felt calm, focused on my task. I checked a couple of traps, but they were empty, so I moved deeper in. Around mid-morning, the sun was higher and the heat was starting to build. Sweat trickled down my back, and I could feel my shirt sticking to my skin. I decided to take a break near a clearing where the water was shallower, a spot I've rested at before. I sat on a fallen log, took a swig from my canteen, and just listened to the sounds around me. That's when I first noticed something off. The birds had gone quiet, not just a little. It was dead silent, like someone had thrown a blanket over the whole swamp. I've been in enough quiet moments to know when it's natural and when it's not. This felt wrong. My skin prickled, and I found myself gripping my rifle tighter. I stood up slowly, scanning the area. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the same old trees and murky water. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Something was about 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a thicket of sawgrass. My heart started thumping hard in my chest, and I could feel it in my ears. I raised my rifle, not aiming yet, just ready. I thought it might be a bear or a large deer, but as I squinted, I realized it was neither. It was tall, maybe 7 feet or so, but it was hunched over, like it was carrying a heavy weight on its back. Its arms were long, way longer than any man's, hanging down almost to its knees, and it was covered in hair. Thick, matted hair that was a mix of grey and black, like it had been rolling in ashes and mud. The hair wasn't smooth. It was clumped and shaggy, moving in patches as the creature shifted. I couldn't see its face clearly because it was turned away from me, but I got the impression of something broad and dark. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out all over my body. This wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. I've encountered bears, wolves, even a panther once. But this was different. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like it was searching for something. Its posture was stooped, but it didn't look weak. It looked powerful, like it could spring into action at any moment. I stayed perfectly still, hoping it wouldn't notice me. The silence was deafening. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Then it turned its head slightly, and I saw a glimpse of its profile. No distinct features, just a mass of hair. But I thought I saw a dark, deep-set eye. It didn't look human, but it didn't look entirely animal either. It was something in between, and that made my stomach churn. I've heard stories from trappers about strange things in the wilderness, but I always dismissed them as tall tales. Now, faced with this, I felt a deep, primal fear I'd never known before. It was like my body knew this thing was wrong before my mind could catch up. I must have made a noise. Maybe I shifted my weight or my boot crunched on a twig, because suddenly it snapped its head toward me. I didn't see its eyes clearly, but I felt its gaze. It was intense, predatory. For a second, we just stared at each other. I could see its chest moving as it breathed, the hair on its body ruffling slightly in the breeze. Then, without warning, it bolted, but it didn't run like any creature I've ever seen. It didn't sprint on 2 legs or 4. It moved in this loping gait that was unnaturally smooth. Its long arms swung wide, and it almost seemed to glide over the ground, covering distance in huge, bounding strides. The way it moved was fluid but jarring, like it was half running, half sliding, and it made no sense to my eyes. I've seen deer run, bears charge, but this was different. It was fast, incredibly fast, and it vanished into the thicker part of the swamp in seconds. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I stood there, rifle still raised, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I took a few steps forward, my legs feeling like jelly. The ground was soft and muddy, and I sank a little with each step. I could see where it had been. The sawgrass was bent, and there were impressions in the mud, but they weren't clear tracks. They were smeared, like something had dragged itself away. I followed, my mind racing. What was that thing, a bear? No, bears don't move like that, and they don't have arms that long. A man? But no man could be that tall or covered in hair like that. I tried to make sense of it, but my thoughts were jumbled. Fear had taken over, and every shadow seemed to move. The swamp felt alive in a way it never had before. Every rustle of leaves, every drip of water made me jump. I pushed deeper, my boots sinking into the muck. The air felt heavier, colder, even though the sun was still up. I could smell something new, a musky, earthy scent like wet dog and rotting wood that hung in the air where the creature had been. I kept my rifle ready, scanning left and right. I half expected to see it again, maybe waiting for me behind a tree, but there was nothing. After about 10 minutes of stumbling through the swamp, I came to a small creek. The water was murky, and on the other side the undergrowth was thick. I saw a broken branch and some disturbed mud, but that was it. No footprints, no hair caught on thorns, nothing. It was like the thing had disappeared into thin air. I waded across the creek, the cold water seeping into my boots, but I didn't care. I had to know. I searched for what felt like an hour, but I found nothing. No signs, no sounds. The birds started chirping again, slowly at first. Then all at once, like whatever had scared them off was gone. That made it worse. It was as if the swamp had returned to normal, but I knew what I'd seen. My hands were still trembling, and I felt dizzy. I leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath. The fear was starting to give way to confusion, and then to a deep, unsettling dread. I decided to head back. I wasn't going to find anything, and I didn't want to be out there when it got dark. The walk back felt twice as long. Every noise made me flinch. A squirrel scrambling up a tree, the wind rustling leaves, even my own footsteps sounded too loud. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those long arms or that stooped posture following me. But there was nothing. When I got back to my cabin, it was late afternoon. I dropped my gear by the door and sat on the porch, just staring out at the trees. My mind was replaying it over and over, the way it moved, that loping gait, the hair, the silence. I tried to tell myself it was a bear or a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. I've spent my whole life in these woods, and I know what I saw. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, fleeing into the swamp. I've gone back a few times since then, always during the day, always with my rifle, but I've never seen anything like it again. No tracks, no sounds, no nothing. It's like it was never there. But I know it was. And that's what haunts me. The not knowing, the way it just vanished without a trace. To this day, I can't explain it. I've heard folks talk about Bigfoot or wild men, but I never put much stock in that. Now I'm not so sure. Whatever it was real, and it's left me with a fear I can't shake. Sometimes when I'm out in the swamp, I get that same cold feeling, and I wonder if it's still out there watching, but I'll never know for sure. Story 14. It was a Tuesday morning, last October. The air had that chilly bite to it that makes you wish you'd worn a thicker jacket. I was running late for work again, which was pretty much my normal routine. My old Chevy pickup has this exhaust leak I've been meaning to get fixed for months. But you know how it is. Money's tight, and it's just one of those things you keep putting off. It's obnoxiously loud, a deep, rumbling roar that seems to shake the very trees when I gun it. The road to my job is this long, winding gravel path that cuts through a thick stretch of woods in the back country of South Carolina. It's not a road you see other people on very often. Mostly it's just me, the dust cloud my truck kicks up, and the trees pressing in on both sides. That morning, the sun was just starting to burn off the ground fog, leaving everything hazy and kind of soft-focused. I had the radio on, some classic rock station fading in and out, and I was just driving, one hand on the wheel, my mind already at work, thinking about the reports I had to file. The truck was bouncing along, the exhaust roaring, and I remember thinking how the noise seemed even louder than usual, like it was echoing back at me from the woods. It was a constant, aggressive growl that filled up the whole inside of the cab. Then it happened. It wasn't a small ping, it was a solid, sickening thwack that came out of nowhere. One second it was just the roar of the exhaust and the radio. The next there was this explosive sound like a gunshot right in front of my face. The entire windshield right in my line of sight, just spider-webbed. A million tiny cracks radiated out from a single fist-sized impact point right in the middle of the glass. My heart just dropped into my stomach. I actually yelled a short, sharp, "What the hell?" that was swallowed by the noise. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding and spitting gravel. The truck shuddered to a stop, dust billowing up and around the windows, making the world outside look even more blurred. My hands were glued to the steering wheel, gripping it so tight my knuckles were white. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm. I just sat there for a second, staring at the cracked windshield. It was a mess. I couldn't see through it clearly at all. It was just a milky, fractured pane. My first thought was a deer. Maybe one had kicked up a rock from the side of the road, but it was such a solid hit, it felt too deliberate for a random kick. I took a deep, shaky breath, the kind that doesn't really fill your lungs, and unbuckled my seatbelt. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound harsh in the sudden quiet after I'd turned the engine off. The exhaust noise was gone, replaced by an absolute profound silence. No birds, no insects, nothing. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like a weight pressing down on your ears. I stepped out onto the gravel, my work boots crunching. The air was cold and damp. I walked around to the front of the truck, my eyes fixed on the damaged windshield. Up close, it was even worse. The impact point was thick, a starburst of white with deep cracks running all the way to the edges. I reached out and touched it with my fingertips, the glass feeling brittle and dangerous. And that's when I saw movement. It was off to my left in the brush at the edge of the tree line. Not a flicker, not a leaf falling. It was a shift, a solid dark shape moving between the trunks. My head snapped toward it. At first I thought it was a person, maybe another hunter or a hiker who'd thrown the rock as some kind of stupid prank. My anger flared for a second. Who the hell would do that? I took a couple of steps forward, squinting into the shadows under the trees. The fog was still clinging to the lower branches, making it hard to see. "Hey!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the vast quiet. There was no answer. Then I saw it again. It wasn't a person. It was tall, so damn tall. It had to be at least 7, maybe 8 feet, and it was wide, with these huge rounded shoulders that sloped down into a powerful-looking torso. It was covered in dark hair, not like a bear's fur, but more like a thick, shaggy coat. It was walking away from me, deeper into the woods, and it moved with a strange, fluid grace that was completely at odds with its immense size. It didn't lurch or shuffle, it just strode. Its arms were long, swinging slightly at its sides, and its head was kind of set forward on its shoulders. I froze, completely and utterly froze. My brain was screaming at me, trying to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright like that, not for that long, not with that kind of purposeful stride. This was different. This was something else. It took maybe 2 or 3 more steps, and then it seemed to just melt into the thicker undergrowth. It didn't run. It didn't look back. It just disappeared behind a thicket of pines and was gone. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. My mouth was dry as dust. I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on my back, underneath my shirt and jacket. My legs felt like they were made of rubber. I wasn't breathing. I realized I was holding my breath, and I let it out in a ragged, shaky gasp. The silence was back, but now it felt menacing. The woods, which I'd driven through 1,000 times without a second thought, now felt like they were watching me. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every tree seemed to be hiding something. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck was standing straight up. My fight or flight instinct finally kicked in, and it was all flight. I didn't even think about pursuing it. The idea never once crossed my mind. All I wanted was to be back inside the truck, with the doors locked. I turned around, my movements stiff and jerky, and practically ran back to the driver's side. I fumbled with the door handle, my hands trembling so badly I could barely get a grip. I finally yanked it open and scrambled inside, pulling the door shut with a solid, heavy thud. I hit the lock button, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet cab. I just sat there, staring through the cracked windshield at the spot where I'd seen it. My heart was still pounding, a frantic drumbeat in my chest. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. I put my hands on the steering wheel to steady them, but they just kept shaking. I kept expecting to see it step back out of the trees to come toward the truck. I kept scanning the tree line, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. The woods were still and silent. After a few minutes, my breathing started to slow down a little. The initial blinding panic began to recede, leaving behind a deep, cold dread that settled in my gut. I had to get out of there. I had to move. I turned the key in the ignition, my hand still shaking. The engine roared to life, and the loud exhaust, which I'd cursed 1,000 times before, now sounded like the most comforting sound in the world. It was a human sound, a mechanical sound. It was my sound. I put the truck in drive and pulled away slowly, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall, dark figure standing in the middle of the road behind me, watching me go. The gravel crunched under the tires. I drove the rest of the way to work in a complete daze. I don't remember the rest of the drive. My mind was just playing that one moment over and over again, the thwack, the spiderweb on the glass, and then that figure walking away into the shadows. I was a mess all day at work. I jumped at every little sound. My co-workers asked me if I was okay, said I looked pale. I just told them I had a rough morning, that a rock hit my windshield on the way in. I didn't mention the rest of it. Who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself. On my lunch break, I called a glass repair place and scheduled an appointment for a new windshield for the next day. I didn't want to look through that cracked glass ever again. It felt like a reminder, a scar from the encounter. It was only later, when I was sitting at home that evening trying to make sense of it all, that the thought occurred to me. The exhaust. My stupid, loud, broken exhaust. It had been roaring through that quiet stretch of woods, shattering the morning peace. What if the rock wasn't random? What if it was a warning, a shut up and get out of my space kind of message? Nothing else made sense. The thing, whatever it was, had been moving away from me. It wasn't approaching, it was leaving. And it had thrown that rock with incredible force and accuracy from a good distance away, through dense brush. It didn't want a confrontation, it just wanted the noise to stop. That realization didn't make me feel better, it made it worse. It meant it was intelligent. It meant it had made a decision. It wasn't just a wild animal acting on instinct, it was something that had been provoked, and it had reacted. I haven't driven down that gravel road since. I take the long way to work now, adding an extra 20 minutes to my commute. It's worth it. Every time I even think about turning down that road, I get this tight, cold feeling in my chest. I see the cracked glass in my mind. I feel that silence pressing in. And I see that tall, wide-shouldered figure walking away, just disappearing into the trees like it was never there at all. I still don't know what it was. I don't think I ever will. But I know what I saw, and I know I never, ever want to see it again. I still hear that exhaust sometimes when I start my truck, and for a split second, I'm back there on that gravel road, feeling that same chill, that same primal fear, and I know without a doubt that I was the one who was making all the noise in its world. Story 15. That laugh felt like a lifetime ago by the time 4 in the morning rolled around. I'd been sleeping in the guest room on the second floor, the one that looked out over the back deck. I woke up not from a noise, but from a silence. The usual night sounds, the crickets, the rustling in the undergrowth, they were just gone. It was a dead, heavy quiet, And then it came, a low, deep howl that didn't sound like any coyote or wolf I'd ever heard on TV or in documentaries. This was different. It was guttural, like it started in the guts of the earth and rumbled its way out. It wasn't loud, but it was heavy. The kind of sound you feel in your bones, more than you hear with your ears. It made the hair on my arms stand straight up. My heart was already thumping as I slid out of bed. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet. I crept to the window and peeled back the edge of the curtain just enough to look out. The motion-sensitive floodlight wasn't on, so the deck and the yard beyond were just shapes in the deep gloom. That's when I saw it. A cougar, a full-grown mountain lion just lying flat on its belly in the middle of the deck. It wasn't moving. Its head was up, ears pinned back, and it was staring, rigid, into the blackness of the trees. It wasn't hunting, it was hiding. I'd never seen an animal look like that, not in a zoo, not on TV. This was pure, undiluted fear, an apex predator, terrified. My own fear went from a buzz to a shriek in my head. I didn't even think, I just moved. I hurried out of my room and across the hall to Ed's door, pushing it open without knocking. "Ed," I whispered, my voice tight. "Ed, wake up." He grumbled, half asleep. "What? What is it?" "There's something outside. There's a cougar on the deck." That got him up. He was out of bed in a second, pulling on a pair of jeans. "A cougar? Are you sure?" "I'm sure. But it's acting weird. It's scared." We went back to my room, but we didn't go to the big window. That felt too exposed. Instead, we went downstairs to the living room, which had a smaller window that gave us a lower, more angled view of the backyard and the tree line. We crouched down, our heads below the sill, and slowly peered over. The floodlight was still off. The world was shades of black and deep blue. For a full minute we saw nothing, just the dark shapes of the pines and firs. Then Ed gripped my arm, his fingers digging in. "There," he breathed. I saw them, two sets of eyes. They were way back in the trees, but they weren't close together like a deer's or a bear's. They were set really far apart, and they were high up. Way too high, and they were glowing with a faint reddish light. It wasn't a reflection, not like a cat's eyes. This was different, a dull, organic glow like hot coals. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't look away. As my eyes adjusted, the outlines of what those eyes were attached to started to become clearer. There were two of them, two massive dark shapes standing between the trees. One was lower to the ground, and it was moving in this weird, rhythmic bob, like it was crouching and rising, crouching and rising. The other was just swaying, a slow, side-to-side motion that was unnervingly patient. They were huge. I mean, the scale was all wrong. They made the trees look smaller. "The cougar," I whispered. "It came up here to get away from them." Ed didn't say anything. He just got up, moving in a low crouch, and went to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. I heard the click of the key and the scrape of metal. He came back with a pistol, a heavy-looking revolver. He checked the cylinder, his hands steady, but his face pale in the gloom. He nodded at me, and we settled back down to watch. We must have stayed like that for 10 minutes, just watching those red eyes and those shifting, hulking shapes. The silence was absolute. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then, the one that was bobbing took a step forward. It came out from the deeper shadows and into the edge of the yard, maybe 60, 70 feet from the house. The motion-sensitive floodlight on the corner of the deck snapped on. The world exploded into sharp white light and stark black shadows. And there it was, fully illuminated for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, but it was burned into my brain forever. It was enormous. I can't stress that enough. Its shoulders were massive, like a professional wrestler's, but on a scale that wasn't human. They were hunched, powerful. It was covered in hair, a dull, matted brownish grey that looked filthy. Its head was conical, sloping back from a heavy, pronounced brow ridge. I couldn't really see a neck. Its nose was flat and its face was just dark. The red eyes were gone now, probably because of the bright light, but I knew where they were. It was standing half-turned towards us, and one of its long, heavily muscled arms was hanging at its side. The hand was huge. The cougar on the deck let out a sound I'll never forget, a piercing, desperate hiss-spit. It was the sound of an animal pushed past all fear into pure survival instinct. In one fluid, powerful motion, it bounded off the deck, hitting the grass and sprinting for the tree line on the far side of the yard, trying to put as much distance between itself and that thing as possible. The creature in the floodlight reacted instantly. It didn't just turn, it lunged, its whole body uncoiled with a speed that was terrifying for something that size. It let out this sound, a deep, guttural grunt that was followed immediately by a sharp, loud bark. It was a grunt bark, a single explosive vocalization that shattered the silence, and that's when the second one came. It burst from the trees where it had been swaying. It didn't run out. It exploded out like it had been launched. It was even bigger than the first one, I think, or maybe it just seemed that way because of the raw power in its movement. It came out low to the ground, a blur of dark hair and immense muscle. The two of them tore across the yard. They weren't running like a man or even like a bear. It was a gait I can't properly describe, a powerful ground-eating lope. Their strides were impossibly long. They covered the whole width of the yard, a distance I'd guess was 100 feet, in just a few of those thudding steps. I felt the impacts through the floor. Thud, thud, thud. It was a heavy, solid sound, like someone dropping big sacks of grain onto the lawn. And then they were gone. They vanished back into the blackness of the forest as suddenly as they had appeared. The floodlight was still on, illuminating an empty, trampled patch of grass. The silence came back. It was deeper than before, more profound. The insects didn't start chirping again. There were no night birds, nothing. It was as if every living thing for a mile around was still frozen in terror. Ed and I didn't move. We stayed crouched by that window for what felt like an hour, just staring into the now quiet yard, the pistol hanging uselessly in Ed's hand. The initial heart-pounding terror had subsided, leaving behind a cold, deep-seated dread that felt like it had sunk into my marrow. We were both shaking. I could feel a fine tremor in my legs. And when I finally looked at Ed, his face was slick with sweat. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. What do you say after you've seen something that isn't supposed to exist? Something that can scare a mountain lion onto your porch and then move with a speed and power that defied logic. We just sat there on the cold floor, listening to the deafening silence and our own ragged breathing, until the sky outside the window began to lighten from black to a deep, bruised grey. As soon as it was fully dawn, we went outside. The grass was wet with dew. We walked to the spot where the first one had stood under the floodlight. The grass was crushed flat in two huge, deep impressions. They weren't neat footprints. They were just massive, saucer-shaped depressions, like someone had set down two heavy anvils. Farther out, where they had run, the grass was torn up in a wide path with more of those deep, heavy impressions spaced far, far apart. The spacing was what got me. I tried to mimic the stride, and I couldn't even come close. My legs wouldn't stretch that far. We got in Ed's truck and drove straight to the bar we'd been in a few nights before. It was still early, but the same old guy who'd been talking about the sightings was there, having a coffee at the counter. We must have looked like hell because he'd just looked at us and his face went kind of grim. We didn't have to say much. We just said we'd seen something in the woods behind Ed's house last night, something big, two of them. He just nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting us. He told us his own stories then, not like he was trying to scare us, but just stating facts about how his hunting dogs would sometimes just refuse to go into a certain part of the forest, how they'd whine and cower, about finding stacks of rocks or twisted saplings that made no sense. about the feeling of being watched by something that didn't feel like a bear. He said, "Most folks around here who've spent enough time in the deep woods have a story. We just don't talk about 'em much to outsiders." The drive back to the house was quiet. The terror of the night was one thing, the red eyes, the sheer size, the speed, but the thing that settled deep inside me and has been there ever since was the realization. The realization that the cougar, an animal at the very top of the food chain, knew what they were. It knew they were out there, and it was so terrified it sought refuge on a human structure, with us, the other predators. It knew we were the lesser of two evils. That knowledge changed something fundamental in my understanding of the world. The woods weren't just woods anymore. They were a place where things like that lived. Ed sold the house 6 months later. He moved back to the city. He never really talked about it again, and honestly, neither did I until now. But I still dream about it. Not the whole thing, just a single frozen image. Those two dull red lights, set way too far apart and way too high off the ground, watching us from the dark. Just watching, and the crushing, absolute silence that followed them. Story 16. We started around 7 in the morning, and the trail was steep right from the get-go. My legs were burning within the first hour, but it felt good, you know? Like we were earning the views. My partner was ahead of me most of the time, setting a steady pace. We've hiked together for years, so we don't need to talk much. We just fall into this rhythm. I had our 2 Dobermans with me, Max and Luna. They're usually full of energy, pulling on their leashes and sniffing everything. But that day, they were calm, almost too calm. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were just tired from the drive up. The trail wound through dense pine forests, with the smell of sap and damp earth filling the air. Every now and then, we'd break out into a meadow where the sun would hit us, and I could feel the warmth seeping into my skin. We'd covered about 6 miles over 3 hours, according to my watch, and we were making good time. The path was rocky in places, with roots snaking across it, so I had to watch my step. My boots were scuffing against the stones, and I could hear the crunch of pine needles underfoot. The dogs would occasionally stop to drink from a stream or mark a tree, but mostly they stuck close. As we climbed higher, the trees started to thin out, and we reached this basin area with a few small lakes scattered around. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the peaks around us. It was quiet, not just quiet, but that deep, heavy silence you only find in the wilderness. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just this eerie stillness. I remember feeling a little uneasy, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the altitude getting to me. We were coming out of this steep switchback section where the trail zigzagged up a slope, and we emerged into a clearing. It was maybe 50 feet across, with tall grass and a few boulders scattered around. The sun was higher now, casting sharp shadows. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, this scream ripped through the silence. It came from about 50 yards away, in a thick cluster of pine trees. I froze mid-step, my heart slamming against my ribs. It wasn't like any sound I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not an elk, nothing I could place. Bears make this low grunting noise sometimes, and elk bugle. But this was different. It was loud, piercing, like something in pain or rage, and it echoed off the mountains around us. The sound didn't stay in one place. It started moving, diagonally toward us, getting louder with each second. I could hear it shifting, like it was coming closer but not in a straight line. Then it changed into this deep, rhythmic wailing, like a large man moaning but not human. It was too guttural, too raw. I've heard coyotes howl at night and mountain lions scream. They sound like a woman screaming, which is creepy enough. But this was deeper, more primal. It felt like it was vibrating through the ground, up through my feet. My partner stopped and turned to look at me, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, but I just shook my head. I didn't know. I've spent a lot of time in the backcountry, and I've run into all sorts of wildlife, but this was new. The dogs, Max and Luna, they completely froze. Normally, if they hear something, they'll bark or growl, but they just stood there, ears pinned back, tails tucked between their legs. Luna started trembling, a low whine escaping her throat. That's when the real fear hit me. If the dogs are scared, something's wrong. They're not easy to spook. They're Dobermans, for God's sake. They've faced down raccoons and even a coyote once, without backing down. I quickly leashed them, my hands shaking so bad I fumbled with the clips. The sound was still going, that wailing now mixed with what sounded like heavy breathing or grunting. It was so close, maybe 30 yards away, and I could see the pine branches shaking, like something big was moving through them. I pulled the dogs close to me, their bodies rigid against my legs. My partner had his pepper spray out, holding it in front of him like a weapon. I did the same, gripping the can so tight my knuckles turned white. The cold metal felt solid in my hand, but I knew if whatever it was charged us, it might not be enough. We stood there, backs to each other, scanning the trees. The sound was overwhelming now, filling the clearing. It was so loud I could feel it in my teeth, this deep vibration that made my stomach churn. I was sweating, but it was cold sweat trickling down my back. My breath came in short gasps, and I had to force myself to take deeper breaths to stay calm. Time seemed to stretch out. It felt like hours, but later I realized it was only about 3 minutes. 3 minutes of pure, unadulterated terror. I kept expecting to see something, a shape, a flash of movement, but nothing emerged. Just the sound, moving around us like it was circling. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The wailing cut off, and the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. My ears were ringing from the sudden quiet. The dogs were still trembling, and I could feel Luna's heart beating against my leg. We waited for another minute, maybe 2, not moving, just listening. Nothing. The pine trees were still, no more shaking. It was like whatever it was had vanished. My partner lowered his pepper spray, his hand shaking. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice rough. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We started moving again, but this time we were hurrying, almost jogging down the trail. I kept looking back over my shoulder, expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing. The dogs stayed close, their tails still tucked, not pulling or sniffing like usual. The rest of the hike was a blur. We didn't talk much, just focused on putting distance between us and that clearing. Every little noise, a twig snapping, a bird calling, made me jump. My adrenaline was still pumping, and I felt jittery, like I'd had too much coffee. A couple of hours later, we reached a ranger station near the trailhead. There was a White River Forest Ranger there, an older guy with a kind face, checking in hikers. We must have looked like hell, because he asked if we were okay. I told him what happened, stumbling over my words, trying to describe the sound. He listened quietly, nodding, and when I finished, he said, "I heard it too, earlier today, from up on the ridge." He didn't have an explanation. He said he'd been a ranger for over 20 years and had never heard anything like it. He'd reported it, but no one knew what it was. Not a bear, not a cat, nothing on record. That just made it worse, hearing that from someone who's supposed to know these woods inside and out. We drove home in silence, the dogs curled up in the back seat, still subdued. I kept going over it in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was it some animal I'd never encountered? A prank? But out there in the middle of nowhere, who would do that? The sound was too real, too visceral. I've listened to recordings of known animals since then, and nothing matches, not even close. I still don't know what it was. Sometimes I think about going back, but I can't bring myself to do it. That day stuck with me, and I doubt I'll ever forget it. The way the sound moved, the way the dogs reacted, the ranger's confirmation. It all adds up to something I can't explain, and that's the scariest part. Not knowing, just having this gap in my understanding of the world, filled with this eerie, unsettling memory. Story 17. It was one of those perfect spring mornings, the kind that makes you remember why you put up with the rest of the year. The air was cool, but not cold, and the woods were so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. I was out turkey hunting, something I've done since I was a kid with my dad. I knew this particular patch of state forest like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. I'd been set up in a little hollow since before first light, my back against a big old pine tree, my camo making me part of the scenery. For the first couple of hours, it was just me and the woods waking up, a few squirrels chasing each other, birds starting their songs. It was peaceful. I'd done a few soft yelps on my call, but nothing was answering. I didn't mind. Sometimes just being out there is enough. That's when the feeling started. It's hard to describe, but if you've ever felt it, you know. It's a kind of pressure on the back of your neck, a primal itch right between your shoulder blades. It was the feeling of being watched, not like a deer might be looking at you, or even another hunter. This was different. This was a heavy, intelligent kind of watching. I tried to shrug it off. You get spooky sometimes in the woods, especially when you're alone and it's so quiet. Your mind can play tricks on you. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was too keyed up waiting for a tom to come strutting in. But the feeling didn't go away. It got worse. It went from a background nuisance to a screaming alarm in my head. My skin started to crawl like there were ants all over me. The fine hairs on my arms stood straight up. My heart, which had been beating slow and steady, started to pick up its pace. I was still trying to be rational. It's a bear, I thought. A bear caught your wind and is just curious. But I hadn't heard a single twig snap, no rustle of leaves. The woods had gone dead silent. The birds had stopped singing. That's the part that really got to me later, the absolute silence that fell right before it happened. My brain was screaming at me now. It wasn't a thought, it was a pure animal instinct. A voice in my head that wasn't a voice, just a raw, urgent command. Turn around now. I didn't want to. I was facing down the slope into the hollow, and whatever was behind me was up on the ridge. To turn around meant moving, making noise, potentially screwing up my hunt. But the command was so overwhelming, so visceral, that I didn't have a choice. My body was starting to do it before my mind even gave the final okay. I turned my head, slow, trying to be smooth, my neck stiff with a tension I'd never felt before, and I saw it. It was just a flash, a massive red-brown blur, maybe 60, 70 yards away, right on the edge of the ridgeline. It was huge. I'm not talking tall, I'm talking massive. The sheer bulk of it is what my brain locked onto first. It was ducking back, retreating behind a thicket of mountain laurel. The movement was what haunts me the most. There was no sound, none, not a crunch, not a swish, not a snapped branch. It moved with a silence that was impossible for something that big. It was a smooth, fluid, and incredibly fast withdrawal. 1 second it was there, a shape blotting out part of the trees, and then it was just gone. My breath froze in my lungs. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the empty space where it had been. My mind was scrambling, trying to process, trying to put a name to what I'd just seen. A bear? No. The color was wrong. A reddish, rusty brown, not the black or dark brown of the bears around here. The movement was wrong. Bears are powerful, but they don't move with that kind of eerie, weightless grace. And the size, God, the size. It was bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, even on television. My hands were trembling. I could feel the shake starting in my fingers and moving up my arms. I slowly, so slowly, turned my whole body to face the ridge. My shotgun, which had been resting across my knees, now gripped so tight my knuckles were white. I raised it, not to my shoulder, but just holding it ready, my finger resting alongside the trigger guard. I scanned the ridgeline, every shadow, every tree trunk, every cluster of leaves. Nothing. It was just the woods again, the normal, familiar woods that suddenly felt anything but familiar. I tried to recreate the sight in my head, to pull the image back and examine it. But it was like trying to grab smoke. All I had was the impression, huge red-brown, a blur of silent motion. I couldn't make out a face or distinct features. It was just a presence, a living, breathing thing that had been looking at me. And the moment I felt its gaze and turned, it vanished. That's when the full-blown fear hit me. It wasn't just startled surprise anymore. It was a deep, cold, gut-wrenching terror. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy. The adrenaline dumped into my system all at once, making my vision sharp and yet shaky at the same time. I had to get out of there. The thought was absolute, non-negotiable. I had to get back to my camper. I stood up, my legs feeling like wet noodles. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I started backing away from the ridge, my eyes glued to the spot where I'd seen it. My shotgun now held properly, stock against my shoulder, my cheek welded to the wood. I must have backed up like that for 50 yards, stumbling over roots and rocks I couldn't see because I refused to look away from that ridge. Every shadow seemed to move. Every normal tree shape looked like a hunched, waiting form. Finally, when I hit a more open section of hardwoods, I turned and started to half walk, half run. It wasn't a sprint. I was too weighed down by my gear and the sheer, trembling weakness in my body for that. But it was a frantic, clumsy hurry. I kept looking over my shoulder, my head on a swivel, expecting to see it following me, keeping pace just inside the tree line. The silence was still profound. My own crashing footsteps and ragged breathing were the only sounds, and they sounded obscenely loud in the stillness. The mile or so back to the gravel road where my camper was parked felt like 10 miles. Every step was a struggle against the panic that was screaming at me to drop everything and just run. I didn't. Some small, stubborn part of my hunter's brain kept telling me that running blindly through the woods was the worst thing I could do. So I moved as fast as I could while still trying to maintain some semblance of control. When I broke out of the trees and saw the dull silver side of my old camper, I've never felt such relief. It was like a physical weight lifted off my chest. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the lock. I threw the door open, scrambled inside and slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt with a loud final thunk. I stood there in the dim interior, my back against the door, panting, listening. I could hear the blood roaring in my ears. I stayed like that for a long time, just trying to get my breathing under control. I peeked out the little window above the dinette, scanning the edge of the forest. Nothing. It looked peaceful, innocent. But I knew it wasn't. Something was in there, something that had watched me with a quiet, patient intelligence and had moved away with a silence that defied physics. I didn't hunt anymore that day. I sat in that camper for hours, just thinking, replaying it over and over, the feeling of being watched, the silent command to turn, the blur, the terror. It was all stuck on a loop in my head. Later that afternoon, my buddy Mark pulled up in his truck. He'd been hunting a different section of the forest. I must have still looked pale, because the first thing he said was, "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't know how to tell him. I just started talking, the words tumbling out in a messy, disjointed rush. I told him about the feeling, about turning around, about the big red-brown thing that disappeared without a sound. He listened, his face getting more and more serious. He's a practical guy, a logger by trade, not one for wild stories. When I finished, he was quiet for a minute. Then he said, "Show me." I didn't want to go back in there. The thought made my stomach clench. But I also needed to know I wasn't crazy. So I grabbed my shotgun again, and we went back. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long, deep shadows that made the woods feel even more menacing. We went to the hollow first. I showed him where I was sitting, pointed to the ridge where I'd seen it. We walked up there, our footsteps loud in the quiet. We looked for tracks, for any sign. The ground was thick with leaves and pine needles, and we didn't find a single clear print. Nothing. It was like it had never been there. We were about to leave, to write the whole thing off as a weird hallucination brought on by stress and solitude, when Mark stopped me. "What's that?" he said, pointing off to the side of the ridge. We walked over to a small, secluded gully that was choked with young saplings. And that's where we found them. Structures. They weren't elaborate. They were made of broken-off saplings, some as thick as my wrist, woven and jammed into the crooks of other trees. They weren't natural falls. They were deliberate. One was like a lean-to, propped against a big oak. Another was more like an archway. Two saplings bent over and their ends shoved into the ground. They were crude, but they were made. You could see where the smaller branches had been snapped off cleanly. This wasn't the work of the wind or an animal bedding down. This was the work of hands, or something with hands. We just stood there, staring at them. The feeling of dread came washing back over me, twice as strong as before. This was proof. I wasn't crazy. Something was living here, something that built things. That's when we heard it. It started low, from deep within the forest, from the direction of the next valley over. It was a roar, but unlike anything I've ever heard. It wasn't a bear's roar, which is more of a bawling, angry sound. This was deeper, fuller, a rolling wave of sound that seemed to vibrate in your chest. It was impossibly loud, echoing through the trees, and it was filled with a pure, raw power that froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't a sound of pain or a warning. It was a declaration, a statement of presence. It lasted for maybe 6 or 7 seconds, and when it stopped, the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Mark and I looked at each other, our eyes wide. All the color had drained from his face. He's a big, tough guy, and he looked genuinely scared. We didn't say a word. We just turned and got out of there, walking fast, then almost running once we hit the trail, not stopping until we were back at the trucks. We stood by my camper, not talking for a long time. The sun was dipping below the trees. Finally, Mark just shook his head and said, "I believe you." Then he got in his truck and left. I stayed in my camper that night with all the lights on and my shotgun leaning against the door. I didn't sleep. Every little noise from outside, the creak of a tree, the scuttle of a possum, made me jump. That was a few years ago now. I've never gone back to that specific part of the forest. I still hunt, but I stick to more open areas, places where I can see a long way. I'll never forget that day. It wasn't just the sight of it, though. That was bad enough. It was the sequence of it all. The feeling of being watched, so intense, it became a physical command. The silent, swift movement of something so huge it shouldn't be able to move like that. The discovery of those crude structures, proving it wasn't just a passing animal, and then that roar, a sound that didn't belong in these woods, a sound that confirmed everything. It left me with a deep, unsettled feeling that's never really gone away. It reinforced a truth I wish I didn't know, that there are things in the deep woods that we don't understand, things that are intelligent, things that watch us, and that can move through their world without making a sound. The terror of that silent, swift movement and the adrenaline-fueled flight back to my camper is a memory etched into me, a permanent chill in my spine. I know, with a certainty that goes beyond proof, that something was stalking those woods that day, and I know that it saw me long before I ever saw it. Breed, Story 18. I grew up in a little log cabin way up north of Quebec Lake in Ontario. This was back in the late 70s. Our place was pretty isolated, the kind of quiet that gets into your bones. My dad worked in forestry, and my mum did odd jobs from home, so I was pretty much left to my own devices all summer long. The forest was my whole world. I knew every twist in the trails, every good fishing spot, every patch of marshland where the frogs would gather. I was a kid who felt more at home among the pines and black flies than I did in a classroom. That summer, I must have been about 13, I decided to build myself a proper lookout. I'd spent weeks hauling scrap wood and old nails up into a big white pine that stood at the edge of a clearing not too far from the lake's shore. It was a decent climb, maybe 15 feet up, and I'd managed to nail together a platform just big enough for me to lie down on. It wasn't pretty, but it was mine. From there, I could see the whole clearing and a good stretch of the lake through the trees. It was my secret spot. The day it all happened started out perfectly normal. It was a hot, sticky day in July. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes your shirt cling to your back. I'd gotten up early, scarfed down some toast, and told my mom I was going fishing. I had my old fishing rod and a coffee can for digging up worms. I headed down to my spot by the lake, right near where the marsh grasses started to get thick. The ground was soft and damp there, perfect for worms. I was on my knees, digging with a little trowel, my hands getting covered in black muck. The sun was beating down, and the only sounds were the usual ones. The buzz of insects, the occasional call of a loon out on the water, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and then it all just stopped. It wasn't a gradual thing, it was like someone threw a switch. The buzzing, the birds, everything just cut out. The silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight on my ears. You don't realize how much noise a forest makes until it goes completely quiet. It's not peaceful. It's wrong. My skin prickled, and I remember feeling a cold knot tighten in my stomach even though I was sweating. Then the smell hit me. It was this overwhelming stench of rotting meat, just thick and foul, mixed with the damp, earthy smell of wet moss. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I gagged and stood up, looking around, but I couldn't see anything. Nothing was moving. The trees were just still. It was like the whole world was holding its breath. That's when I felt it. That feeling you get when you just know, you're being watched. It's a primal thing. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up. I was scanning the tree line, my heart starting to thump hard against my ribs, and I couldn't see a thing. But the feeling was so intense, it was like a pressure, like eyes were boring into me from everywhere and nowhere at once. I took a step back toward the path, my feet feeling clumsy, and that's when I heard it. A sound I'd never heard before and haven't heard since. It came from the ridges across the lake, echoing in that dead silence, a deep guttural whooping. It wasn't a bird, it wasn't a moose, it wasn't anything I knew. It was low, then it would rise in pitch, a sort of hoo-up sound. It was answered by another one, closer, from my side of the lake. The sound didn't just fill the air, it seemed to vibrate right through me. It was intelligent, it felt like a call, a conversation. I froze solid. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. I just stood there, my fishing rod forgotten in the mud, my breath caught in my throat. Then I saw the grass move. About 50 yards away at the edge of the clearing, the tall marsh grass was bending down like something heavy was stepping on it. But there was nothing there. It was just an invisible pressure creating a path. I could see the stalks flattening, one after another in a line. A branch on a low-hanging bush nearby snapped with a loud crack. But again, there was nothing to see. It was like watching a ghost walk through the world, but a ghost that had weight and substance. That broke the spell. I turned and I ran. I didn't look back. I scrambled up my tree, scraping my hands and shins on the bark, not even feeling the pain. I hauled myself onto my platform and lay there, panting, my whole body trembling. I was trying to be quiet, but my breathing was so loud it sounded like a hurricane in my ears. I peered through the gaps in the wooden planks, down into the clearing. For a few minutes, nothing. The silence was still there, the smell was still there, a little fainter maybe, but that feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, like whatever it was knew exactly where I was. Then, at the far end of the clearing, close to the lake's shore, something appeared. It's the only word for it. It didn't walk out of the trees. One second there was nothing, and the next, it was just there. It was massive. I'm not good at judging height, but it had to be 10, maybe 12 feet tall. It was built like a powerlifter, just immense through the shoulders and chest, covered in stringy brownish-black hair that was matted and wet in places. Its head was conical, sort of pointed at the top, and it sat directly on its shoulders with no real neck to speak of. I couldn't make out its face from that distance, just a dark patch. It moved down to the water's edge, and it moved silently. Not carefully, not quietly. Silently. Its legs, which were huge, just seemed to glide over the ground. There was no sound of footsteps, no crunch of twigs. It was the most unnerving thing about it, that complete and total silence from something so big. It crouched down by the water, its back to me, and I saw it dip its hands into the lake. It was doing something, I couldn't tell what, maybe drinking, maybe feeding. The thought made my stomach turn. I was pressed so flat against the platform, I could feel the rough wood grain digging into my cheek. I was praying it wouldn't turn around. I was praying it wouldn't look up. And then it started to fade. I'm not saying it walked away. I'm saying it became transparent, like smoke, and then it was just gone. One moment it was a solid, physical thing crouched by the water, and the next, the space where it had been was empty. I blinked, sure my eyes were playing tricks on me, but it was gone. The oppressive silence lifted almost immediately. A bird chirped tentatively somewhere. The insect buzz slowly returned. The smell began to dissipate, replaced by the normal scent of pine and water. I stayed in that tree for what felt like hours. I didn't move until the sun was much lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. My legs were stiff and cramping. The fear had subsided from a screaming panic to a deep, cold dread that had settled in my gut. I had to know. I had to see. I climbed down, my hands shaking so bad I could barely grip the branches. I walked slowly, every sense on high alert, toward the spot where I'd seen it. The ground near the shore was soft, wet sand, and there they were, footprints. They were huge. I'm not exaggerating. I put my own foot next to one. My shoe was a child's toy next to it. They had to be at least 20 inches long. The shape was human-like but wider, and the toes, they seemed splayed, and the whole thing was pressed deep into the ground, showing an incredible weight. I followed the tracks for a few yards and they just stopped. They didn't lead into the forest. They didn't lead anywhere. They just ended in the middle of the wet sand, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. And the smell was still there, right at that spot, that same awful stench of decay and wet moss. It was strongest right where the tracks ended. I ran home. I didn't stop. I burst through the cabin door, white as a sheet and covered in sweat and dirt. My mom asked me what was wrong, and I just mumbled something about seeing a bear and feeling sick. I don't think she believed me, but she let it go. I never went back to that tree platform. I never went fishing in that spot again. For the rest of that summer and for weeks after, I'd hear those whooping calls sometimes, late in the evening, echoing across the lake. They'd send a chill right through me every single time. Even now, decades later, the memory is crystal clear. It wasn't just some animal. Animals don't do that. They don't just appear and disappear. They don't move in complete silence. They don't make the whole forest go quiet just by being nearby. What I saw that day, I believe it could hide itself, not just camouflage, but truly become invisible. It's the only thing that makes any sense. It explains the footprints that went nowhere. It explains why I only saw it when it chose to be seen. That's why these things are so hard to find. They don't want to be found, and once they've shown themselves to you, even for a second, you never ever forget it. You just learn to live with the chill that never really goes away. Story 19. I still get chills thinking about it, even after all these years. This happened back in 1966, when I was just a kid. My family had just bought this old farm out in Ohio on what was then County Road 28. I think it's called Headedley's Mill Road now. We were so excited about it. My dad had talked for months about getting away from the city, having some land, maybe raising a few animals. The farmhouse was old, really old, with creaky floors and that smell of dust and wood that hadn't been aired out in years. We decided to camp out there for the first weekend before we started fixing the place up properly. That Friday, we drove out with sleeping bags and a cooler of food, nothing fancy. I remember the drive felt long, with the fields stretching out and the trees getting thicker as we got closer. When we pulled up, the house looked kind of sad and lonely, but in a way that made it feel like an adventure. We spent the evening unpacking, and my mom tried to make it cozy by lighting a few candles, since the electricity wasn't hooked up yet. I fell asleep on a mattress we'd thrown on the floor, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls. It was one of those sounds that's peaceful at first, but looking back, it had an edge to it, like the house was whispering secrets. The next morning, I woke up because something felt off. It wasn't the sun or any noise, just this heavy silence that pressed down on me. I opened my eyes and saw my dad pacing back and forth near the window. He had this big wrench in his hand, like he'd grabbed it from the toolbox we'd brought. His face was tight, and he was moving stiffly, like he was trying to keep quiet but couldn't stay still. My mom was sitting on the edge of another mattress, and she was crying softly, her shoulders shaking. I'd never seen her like that before. Usually, she was the one keeping things together. I sat up, my heart starting to beat faster. "What's wrong?" I whispered, because the air felt too thick to talk loud. My dad stopped pacing and looked at me. His eyes were wide, almost wild, and he pointed toward the window. "Look out there," he said, his voice low and rough. "Just look." I crawled over to the window, my knees scraping against the rough wooden floor. The glass was dusty, but I wiped a spot clean with my sleeve and peered out. County Road 28 ran right past our property, and there was a small bridge maybe 50 yards away crossing over a creek. The bridge had a rail that my dad had said was about 6 feet tall when we'd explored the day before, and that's when I saw it. Walking down the road, right in the middle, was this tall, black, hairy figure. It was moving slowly, like it didn't have a care in the world, but everything about it was wrong. Its head was way up there. I could see it clearly over the bridge rail. My dad had measured that rail the day before, joking about how high it was, and he'd said it was 6 feet. This thing's head was a good 2 feet above that, so it had to be 8 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered in thick, dark hair that looked almost wet in the morning light, and it walked with a kind of sway, like its legs were too long for its body. It didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen, not a bear or anything. Bears don't walk upright like that, not for that long, and they're not that tall. I felt this cold knot form in my stomach. My breath caught in my throat and I couldn't look away. It was like my eyes were glued to it. The thing was just ambling along, not hurrying, and it didn't turn its head or anything. It was headed toward the woods on the other side of the bridge. The sun was starting to come up, casting long shadows, and the creature stood out against the pale road like a black cutout. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, and my hands were shaking so bad I had to grip the windowsill to steady myself. My dad came up behind me, his hand on my shoulder. It was trembling too. "Stay quiet," he murmured, and then he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door. "We're going out there." I didn't want to go. Every part of me was screaming to hide, to curl up under the blankets and pretend none of this was happening. But my dad's grip was firm, and there was this intensity in his eyes that scared me even more. My mom let out a little sob, but didn't say anything as we slipped out the front door. The air outside was cool and damp, with that early morning chill that makes your skin prickle. The grass was wet with dew, and our feet made soft squishing sounds as we hurried across the yard. My dad kept the wrench raised like he was ready to swing it, but his steps were cautious. We stopped near the edge of the road, maybe 20 feet from the bridge, and just watched. The creature was still walking, not even glancing back. It reached the other side of the bridge and stepped off the road into the tree line. The woods were thick there, full of oaks and pines, and it disappeared into the shadows like it had never been there. One moment it was visible, that huge dark shape, and the next it was gone, swallowed up by the trees. It didn't make a sound, no cracking branches, no rustling leaves, nothing, just silence. We stood there for what felt like forever, but it was probably only a minute or two. My dad's breathing was ragged, and I could feel the sweat on his palm where he held my arm. He finally let go and walked slowly toward the bridge, his eyes scanning the ground. I followed, my legs feeling like jelly. When we got to the spot where the creature had been, my dad knelt down and started looking for tracks. The road was gravel and dirt, and the ground was soft from recent rain, but there was nothing. No footprints, no marks, not even a disturbed patch. It was like it had floated over the surface. He ran his hands over the gravel, shaking his head. "There's nothing here," he muttered, more to himself than to me. His voice was hushed, almost reverent, but in a scared way. We searched around the bridge and the edges of the woods, but it was the same. No sign that anything had passed through. The only tracks were ours from the day before. My dad kept looking, his face getting paler with each passing minute. I remember the way the morning light hit the dew on the spider webs, making them sparkle, and how normal everything looked except for this dread hanging over us. After a while he stood up and wiped his hands on his pants. "Let's go back inside," he said, and his tone was flat, like all the fight had gone out of him. When we got back to the farmhouse, my mom was still sitting there, but she'd stopped crying. Her eyes were red, and she looked at my dad with this question in her face, but he just shook his head and put the wrench down. He didn't say a word about what we'd seen, not then, not ever. That was the thing. He refused to talk about it. If I brought it up later, he'd change the subject or get quiet and walk away. It was like that morning never happened. Except it did, and it changed everything. The rest of the day, the atmosphere in that house was thick with fear. We packed up our things and left earlier than we'd planned. My mum tried to act normal, making sandwiches for lunch, but her hands were shaking, and she kept glancing out the window. I couldn't eat. My stomach was in knots. All I could think about was that tall, black figure and how it had moved so calmly, like it belonged there more than we did. In the car on the way home, my mum finally said something. She turned to me in the back seat and said, "You saw it too, didn't you?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. I just nodded, and she reached back to squeeze my hand. "We don't know what it was," she said, "but we saw it." That was the only admission I ever got from her. My dad stayed silent the whole drive, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. We never went back to live on that farm. My dad sold it a few months later, and we moved on. But that morning stuck with me. I've thought about it thousands of times over the years. The way the creature's hair seemed to ripple in the breeze, the way it didn't look back, like we weren't even worth noticing. The sheer size of it, towering over everything, and the silence. That's what gets me the most. No sound, no tracks, no explanation. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see it walking down that road, and I feel that same cold fear. I've read stories online about Bigfoot or other things, and some of them sound similar, but nothing ever quite matches what I saw. My dad's refusal to talk about it made it even scarier, like it was something too big or too awful to put into words. My mom's admission was the only thing that kept me from thinking I'd imagined it, but it didn't make it any less real. That one morning in Ohio, on County Road 28, left a mark on me that's never faded. I don't know what that thing was, and I probably never will, but I know it was there, and I know it was real. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still get that feeling, like something's watching from the shadows, and I remember how small and helpless I felt, standing there with my dad, watching something we couldn't understand disappear into the woods.